Oh, here we go. Okay, so before we start talking about chapters 18 to 31 of part 2 of Don Quixote, anything, I guess, not related to the questions that I've asked about just these chapters that anyone would like to bring up at this point? Any business, anything like that? Okay, then let's get to these questions. So my first question is about this funny, what strikes me as a joke. There might be more to it than it's being just a joke, but it at least has the form of a joke. On 600 to 601, the kind of joke that Cervantes seems to make with not irregular frequency. So we hear at 600 to 601, at the bottom of 600 and the top of 601, that the author is going to omit a description of every detail of Don Diego de Miranda's house, but because they, quote, aren't relevant to the principal purpose of the history, which derives its strength from its truthfulness rather than from full digressions. So put the minutiae aside. And yet, in the following paragraph, there seems to be plenty of minutiae. Most conspicuous in my mind is the description of Quixote as taking 5 bucketfuls of water, or maybe 6, because there's some difference of opinion as regarding the number of bucketfuls with which he washed his hair at this moment. Okay, what's going on here? How should we interpret this joke, along with the various elements of it that I've laid out in the paragraph, a longer paragraph in question 1? What is the notion of truthfulness that's at work in the part that I've excerpted and quoted on 600 to 601? Is that bit serious in some way? What do you think? Cindy?
I'm sorry, I was just going to point out that actually my book says dull digressions rather than full digressions. And I think that makes a bit of a difference
Okay.
because
Yep, it's dull digressions. You're right. It's this typo.
it's more of, it's kind of a suggestion that describing the house and things like that, minutia, is dull. So I just think that's a little different. Um, I don't, I mean, the whole thing about Sancho or I'm sorry, about Don Quixote and what he, how he removes his armor and how many bucketfuls of water I have, I guess, because I was looking at it as the dullness issue, I guess, and that's why I pointed out the difference is that I guess for some people, every detail of the house might be very, very interesting, right? So it might suggest that he's just um, suggesting that that's kind of not worth it in a sense, that it doesn't have any value. So then it suggests that the description of Don Quixote has some interest, isn't dull, and has some value. And I guess personally, I guess I'm not that interested in furniture styles and stuff, so I guess it was more interesting to hear about Don Quixote. But I do think that just part of it was just being flip and being funny. You used the word, that it was a joke, and I think it was kind of joking. But I also think it could be perhaps, and I don't know if the style at that time was to go full on, House Beautiful about, settings and things like that, and that might have been some of the reason he did it. So those are the things that struck me about that.
Okay, I mean, but I take it, Cindy, even if you find a description of Quixote's clothes and appearance more interesting than a description of Don Diego de Miranda's house, you don't find the question of how many bucketfuls of water he poured over himself engaging. That's surely dull, right? So
Right. I think that that's meant to be more humorous,
yeah,
purposely humorous. Like,
yeah.
okay, we're arguing over how much water he poured on himself. So, and I don't know where that comes from. Do you know what I mean? Where he would think that someone would argue about where is the version of 5 buckets as opposed to 6 buckets.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I
Why
mean,
make the joke? What is Cervantes doing with this? I
right,
think.
right. So but it does more and more put him in, suggesting that he's translating from something that he's then making a decision what to translate.
I mean, I take it you're referring to the fact we haven't heard that there are multiple sources on what Quixote is up to.
Right,
Uh, where did that come from? Why make a joke about that?
right,
Uh,
right.
yeah.
So he had to make that too, basically make that up too, I think. Even if you believe he's translating the original.
Which of course none of us do. I mean, no reader of
Right,
this
right.
read that, but yeah. Karen, go ahead.
Well, I think I took it slightly differently. Yes, to describe the house would be kind of some dull minutia, but in describing Don Quixote, it's not really about the minutia, it's about the impression that it's trying to create. So yeah, 6 bucketfuls of water says that he was really, 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 really dirty, right? Really, really covered. And his appearance, I mean, I feel like it's trying to re-ascertain that his appearance is really strange and weird. We're still trying to figure out, is he mad? Isn't he mad? And it, contributes again, that description more than minutia, it continues to create this overall impression of this guy looks really, really weird as he's traveling around.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, so it wasn't in service of description as much as it was like net impression of his oddness.
So that he's pouring buckets full of water over himself is an indication that he's pretty dirty. Which, that's what happens when you're sleeping in the rough and living on the road and so forth.
Yeah.
But the question of whether he took 5 or 6 bucketfuls, I mean, that doesn't really serve to indicate that he's more or less dirty, right? That just seems like a kind of meaningless or trivial piece of.
Well, it's trivial, but there's that little sentence that says, and the water still went the color of whey. So, after all those buckets full. So he must have been incredibly dirty and full of the, whey curds and everything. I mean, what kind of impression can a knight make, traveling around looking so ridiculously dirty?
Well, so you're taking this much more earnestly to have a kind of earnest purpose in characterizing Quixote than I, or it sounded like Cindy.
Well, except that I think it's to make him look kind of humorous and weird,
But
yeah.
in service of making the story vivid and more meaningful for us, rather than just kind of a silly, the silly inclusion of
it's silly, but it's in service of us continuing to wonder, like, just how mad is this guy traveling around like this? When if he had some sanity, he would choose to clean himself up.
Sorry, I need to finish the thought before I think it makes sense.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
So I take it if this had had the same description and said he poured 5 bucketfuls of water over himself, or it had the same description and said definitively he poured 6 bucketfuls of water over himself, it would make absolutely no difference to the meaning of the passage, whether it were the one or the other. So what seems to me the triviality is that the author, whoever that is, pauses to say, well, we have different sources on whether it was 5 bucketfuls or 6. I mean, that, I take it, doesn't serve the purpose of characterizing Quixote as especially dirty and mad looking, right? Or do you see that as actually meaningful in a way that I'm seeing it as meaningless?
Like, I guess I mean, it sounds trivial, but I guess I saw it as a little more meaningful, because if people are arguing over just how dirty he is, then, then he is at a very extreme end of the continuum of physical presence that we find acceptable.
I see. Okay. Well, Yeah, that is not an angle that I considered before. I'll pose this. Steve?
I have a third. I mean, to me, that sentence is hysterical. I mean, it's a long sentence. I don't want to read the whole thing through, but you go from the 5-6 buckets of water, or 6, because that's some difference of opinions to regard the number of bucketfuls and wash his hair and face, and you get all the way down to the end with a punchline reminding you of Sancho's greed and the purchase of those foul curds that turned his master so fair. I found myself laughing at the end of the sentence when I read it the first time. I just think that this is one where I think this is the author having fun with the style and starting with something, having declaimed that something's, too boring to be a detail, going exactly where you're saying, no, we're going something that's like mind-boringly numb. And simply by the way he structures the sentence, giving you, a reminder for any of you who've forgotten about one of the funniest things, in the recent part of the book with the putting the thing on his head and having the stuff ripped down him. So I think this is a little bit of an extended joke.
Do you have any reading of, so it sounds like you and I, Steve, are reading this very similarly. Why say, before you go on to give this extended joke about the including minutiae, just after you said you'll include no minutiae, that because the history doesn't need it, because it derives its strength from its truthfulness rather than from dull digressions. Correct my typo. Why the mention of truthfulness there? Is that just another joke? Like everybody knows this is a pile of lies, so any merit that the author's attributing to it in 600 before undermining that in the next paragraph is even itself in doubt, so it's all just silliness? Or is there something about the mention of truthfulness there that's actually meaningful?
In this context, I took it as more of a stylistic flourish that is not terribly meaningful, other than in the sense that we've talked about all along. I mean, he's clearly playing with the multiple levels of understanding. And, how do you understand? And you can get into the, how do you determine truth in a history from truth in a comedy? I mean, there's a lot of ways you could take it. But I actually see this as more of a kind of a surface level riff on the notion, which again reminds you, as Karin said, exactly what he looks like. But I found myself kind of half guffawing at the end of the sentence. And so as much as anything, whether that's the author or the translator showing off his chops, I found the rhythm and the way that sentence worked had me kind of, visualizing exactly what he looked like and laughing at it.
Okay, Gary, and then Artem.
I think the other thing, and we've touched on this before, is Cervantes has found a way to have humor that has nothing to do with the story. I mean, he's making fun of the writing. It's a very kind of, he makes fun of, we talked about this. Literally, the first thing we talked about is who's telling this story. So you start out wondering about the structure, which had to, I would think would have had to have been a very weird concept when this was written. And yet throughout this, he sort of pulls back and makes fun of the way in which the story is told. And I don't know if it has some, philosophical meaning and it fits into, the philosophy of humanism, but it's just another way to inject humor into this story that's more than just a series of episodes. I mean, it's the very structure of the book that he finds a way to make humorous, if that makes any sense.
So the level of the humor here is it's playing with our sense of the kind of grip of the writer over his own craft, something like that, rather than.
Well, I think what I'm saying is, first of all, it's ridiculous, right? Because he tells so many stories that have so much minutia, where he goes into endless details. Just think about the wedding that is yet to come, and his descriptions of the food and the way the field has the covering over it. I mean, he just goes in endless detail. So it's ridiculous because, of course, by now we all know that he loves talking about things in great detail and uses them for humor. So to say that it's too trivial or too detailed is ridiculous. But he's doing it in the context of talking about the way the book supposedly is written, which we also know is ridiculous because, of course, we know that there's an actual, author who's making up all of it. It's just I don't know if meta is the right way to talk about it. The way in which an author thinks about the way in which he writes, and then uses that not only to tell the story, but since this is a comedy, to have comedy at kind of every level of the creation of this book.
Right. So I guess the way that I was thinking about it, as you're saying, what separates this from being a series of funny episodes? Well, there's a kind of humor that takes place at the level of the story involving Quixote and the other characters, and even the stories within the stories. And then there's a kind of humor that takes place at the level of the writer's voice and awareness of, or the writer's plural voices and their awareness of their own creation. So here, I take it you're saying, Gary, the author kind of vainly rejects the idea that the purpose of this history is served by including minutiae, but he does that all the time. And on the other hand, pretends like he's a scrupulous historian about details as small as how many buckets full of water Quixote would have poured over himself. But of course, we know this is a novel coming all out of the head of one guy. So fussing about historical detail, let alone historical detail so trivial, is itself a kind of a joke at the level of the writer rather than the characters in the story. I take it that's what you mean by there's humor at every level of the novel. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Artem, go ahead.
Actually, when I read first time, it reminded me of 9 Stories by Salinger. The first one, The Perfect Day at Banana Fish, when he was basically starting with a very particular numbers, like 97 men were on exact time, and the number of the room, and it was very particular. And the funny part is it never got mentioned later. So all the numbers he talked about was just, I guess, for fun. So it kind of just reminded me of that. And I thought that maybe Cervantes was doing it first not mentioning the description and then mentioning the details about Don Quixote. It's just sort of a maybe muscle, how the bodybuilders play with their muscles, I think. But in the literature sense, he's kind of making fun of the genres and the writers that, because it's sort of a conservative type of writing. You enter the room and then you describe the room very thoroughly, especially the books we were reading a few hundred years ago. They're very, very particular description usually, and it's very traditional. And I think he sort of makes fun of that. So it's this sort of a type of meta fiction, when he goes out of the book and kind of just criticizes genre. And then when he starts talking about this particular numbers of buckets, it's, I don't know, I think it's just sort of like a meta humor. Maybe at least that's what I thought.
So the thought is, Artem, Cervantes is having his author say, look, I know it's common in novels like this for people to, thinking of this as a conservative way of writing is interesting, to give a scrupulous description of every location so that we can visualize it really clearly, as if we're doing the equivalent of watching a play rather than reading a novel or something like that. And he's saying, well, I'm not going to do that because the purpose of this story is different. It's derives its strength from its truthfulness. I should say its virtue is different from its just ability to paint a picture through the mentioning of minutiae. And then so he's kind of flexing. There's a literary flex with that claim that.
But he also stretches genre.
Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think you kind of told, I think you kind of something you were saying made me think about stretching genre.
In what sense? I mean, at what moment in what we're talking about? Because I could say that happening in a few different places potentially.
Because it's just like I think that further we go, it's the conservative type of writing is very very like formulaic when you know, like I already said about the describing stuff, but like that he brought the sort of a, like how you can write books, that sometimes you don't need to describe things, sometimes you can skip something, sometimes you can write something that previously wasn't written. Maybe I'm just putting some words in his mouth, but I'm not very like a big master and professor on very like old literature, so I cannot really say that, oh, every single book was describing, you know, scrupulously, and now he makes fun of it. Like I'm just sort of assuming that he's saying, you know, here's other ways to write things, and it's fine too.
Right. Okay. So it's a joke about genre in that you're assuming he's referring to the other way people write and saying my book is different. But then he has this like kind of ludicrous slipping into dwelling on minutiae with this description of Quixote and the bucketfuls. I mean, it strikes me that with the note about the bucketfuls, there's a concern about truthfulness there. I got to make sure I get the number of bucketfuls right. Sources differ. That's the kind of thing that a scholar does when they're trying to mark. You know, there's controversy about this. I don't want to land too hard on one side and mislead you by thinking it was 5 bucketfuls, having you think it was 5 bucketfuls or 6 definitively, because, you know, my care is for the truth rather than for certainty or something like that. Does anyone have a view about why that kind of certainty arises in this passage just after, concern for truthfulness arises in this passage just after the author has said this history derives its strength from truthfulness rather than from dull digressions? Any thoughts about that? Okay, well, maybe there isn't all that much to say about this, just this small joke. I can move on. All right, so second question. I'm going to move to chapter 19. Another small question. It's about a small detail, but it struck me as interesting in relation to other kinds of episodes like this one. So as I noted in the question, at a number of times in the novel, especially from Quixote, but occasionally from others, we get these, I think, what are customary set speeches, the kind that you give on an occasion that calls for rhetoric, say at a dinner party or when you're giving a speech on a formal occasion or something like that, in which one character praises some art or some way of life. Quixote does this all the time with knight errantry. He does it with poetry when he's speaking to Don Diego de Miranda. He'll often give long speeches in which he distinguishes knight errantry from other ways of life or professions that he also praises or whose virtues he distinguishes. We get something that seems to me like a species of that kind of a speech or disagreement here between Corchuelo and the MA. The MA saying studying the science of fencing is of great value, something he says both before he makes his demonstration and afterward, and explains at length. And Corchuelo rejecting the claim, saying, you know, I'm just as good a fencer or better without having made this study. What's different about this episode is that we get a character praising this way of life or discipline, and then giving a demonstration of its superiority that puts the question beyond doubt. It's not mere words, there's actually a kind of virtuoso display that substantiates the praise speech. So what do you think? How should we think about this duel in relation to these kinds of episodes in the novel where somebody gives a praise speech that often Quixote and often about something that we see him failing at pretty regularly? Yeah, Steve.
I mean, a really simple headline level: actions speak louder than words. I mean, he's kind of, you know, at another. I mean, he's, you know, to some degree, that's what Quixote is doing in the book. He is not simply letting these words sit on shelves to be forgotten and never acted on, or simply being read and enjoyed. He's taken on himself to take action and recreate or try to bring back the study, not the study, but the discipline, the actual discipline of knight errantry. And I think this is kind of a mini version of that. You know, you can read all you want to about it and pretend that you know, but here we have the actor proving his superiority.
Okay, so the MA is a Quixote figure. He doesn't just study something, even if he also does that. He has an MA, but he demonstrates the value of studying that thing through his actions. Quixote is the same, although of course Quixote is a kind of funhouse mirror of the MA in that he tries to be a knight errant, and it doesn't go in this way, where we don't see him demonstrate to the people he habitually conquers or rescues that being a knight errant is a great thing. Thanks, Cindy.
So, I mean, I agree with what people are saying about the end of the fight, but I think what's also interesting is this starts because it's a discussion of how people learn to talk posh, actually, is the way Sancho basically says, I didn't have an opportunity to learn how to talk posh at the top. And then the student, who I believe is the MA, is saying that basically you can walk around the cloisters and you talk in elegant and clear language. And he says, I, sir, for my sins, studied canon law at Salamanca, and I take some pride in expressing myself in clear, plain, and meaningful language. Then the BA, Corcello, says, if you didn't take more pride in how you wag those foils of yours than how you wag your tongue, you'd have been top of the class instead of bottom. So basically, the situation is, as I read it, is that the fencer, the good fencer, the MA, thinks he's, has really spent more time fencing in school than studying. And that's, so in the end, you still haven't resolved the problem of the language, but yes, he is a very good fencer, but it's in the context of him actually being at the bottom of his class. So I don't know what that says, but it says something else. But it certainly says that he, in a sense, like Don Quixote, has become obsessed with something else and focused on that. And he ends up quite good at it, even while he's apparently flunking his courses, according to the guy who wasn't as good. I don't know what his grades are. Right? They
don't hear. He has a lesser degree, so that maybe that's some indication of BA.
Maybe that's right. Maybe it's easier to, like, when you're an MA, but that was there was a cost for that fencing skill, in a sense. And
so that's interesting. So Cindy, I take it you've given, in addition to the parallel that Steve brought up, you've given us another parallel between the MA and Don Quixote, namely, Don Quixote neglected his ordinary life, the life that everyone else expected him to be leading, and lost himself in books, works of knight errantry, of chivalry, which he took to be kind of instruction manuals ultimately, or a series of grand precedents for a way of life that one should revive. And likewise, the MA, if the BA Corchuelo is to be believed, the MA has neglected the studies that he's expected to be applying himself to in favor of serious devotion to this other science, fencing. But unlike Quixote, he actually is a really great fencer. He's gotten some serious benefit out of his applying himself to the study of fencing. Okay, so that's two, it seems, parallels between Quixote and the MA, both of which are making me think this must be a kind of meaningful digression or a little episode, what the meaning is. And I guess it's up to us. Marjorie, go ahead. Marjorie, you're muted.
I'll get it one of these times. I saw a relationship between this chapter and the previous chapter because I felt like in the previous chapter, he was sort of making fun of students and scholars who study minutia and to, you know, until you can't stand it anymore. Is it 4 buckets, 5 buckets, whatever. And he's making fun. In this chapter, he sort of reverses it and supports the study of something. So I kind of saw him as a point counterpoint on scholarly pursuits.
That's interesting. So the disagreement over the number of bucketfuls of water that Quixote pours over his head is a scholarly and pedantic disagreement. It's a obsession with small details of a kind that's so typifies scholars' concerns. I can
Right.
say that is fairly accurate. And if there was a kind of denigration, a mockery of scholarship, at least historical scholarship, or at least of the scholarship among the kinds of historians who would disagree or try to provide histories of Quixote's life. There's a vindication of scholarship in this chapter with someone who's made a really dedicated study of a science, fencing, a study whose value isn't obvious to the BA, demonstrates that study actually has great value. So scholarship rises after it's fallen. That's another interesting thought. Have I got the thought right, Marjorie?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Artem.
Actually, yeah, I didn't think about that. I think it's really, really good point. It's I didn't like. It made me think that he maybe makes fun of this humanitarian, scientists who are, studying like something like language or culture or books or philosophy, where there is no sort of you can't really measure it that much, and so he basically compares the scientists who study, for example, books, or who do something more useful, for example, or something that you actually can like, you can be scrupulous with fencing, and actually you will be better fencer. So, and if you are scrupulous about numbers of buckets because you're studying, for example, literature, it's maybe not as successful. I don't know.
Okay, so this makes me think that I should have asked about how this relates to the content of chapter 18, most of which I just skipped over. So in much of chapter 18 is taken up with Quixote talking about the value of poetry, how to pursue it well, in what way one should, where one should set one's ambitions if one's a poet. He's talking about Don Lorenzo, the son of Don Diego de Miranda. And Artem, I take it poetry, maybe the kinds of questions about how to live well that Quixote is entertaining more generally fall into the category of discussions or disciplines that you're referring to. They're not like fencing, where you can just give a demonstration as to their value by beating someone else in poetry or in philosophy or something like that. Fencing is another kind of study that I take it points up what's distinctive about things like poetry or humanistic studies by admitting of demonstration so readily, where you can get the point just by like watching somebody beat someone else having learned the study. So that makes it seem like this is directly related to the discussion of, I take it, Quixote's attempt to vindicate Don Lorenzo's pursuit in the eyes of Don Diego de Miranda, who disapproves of what his son does initially, and Quixote is going to try to come to the defense of poetry and the study of it. What the nature of that connection is, I don't know, but I'm seeing the connection that you're drawing between these two kinds of disciplines. Another thing that, if you're a humanist, is very familiar, trying to explain to people, what's the point of what you do? Man, that is question that comes up all the time. It will, every time an administrator or somebody who controls the levers of funding in a university has to make a decision about department size or things like that, this topic is evergreen for us. So I take it you're saying that's the one that's at issue in this episode. Yeah, Artem.
But I was just as engineers, my first profession actually. It was a funny part of the studying, actually making fun of humanity, like the people from who study English and stuff. Funny enough, I ended up actually switching to the enemies.
Yeah. Well, I hope, I'm glad that the the mockery didn't keep you on the other side of the fence. That's usually a good way to insulate yourself against being tempted. But glad we got you. Alec, go ahead, and then Charles.
Yeah, this is a very interesting discussion and comparison. And I would also point back to chapter 18, but a different section. In this episode, after the duel, after the demonstration that strength was overpowered by skill, that skill was valuable, Don Quixote says to Corchuelo that, if you take my advice, you wouldn't go challenge somebody that actually studied this skill. And because these people who are actually trained are superior. And this is particular to the discipline of fencing. When we go back to chapter 18 and Don Lorenzo asks Don Quixote, what is exactly the subject of knight errantry? Don Quixote answers with a number of disciplines that were required to be a good knight errant, including he must be a good jurist, to be a theologian, a physician, an astrologer, none of which Don Quixote actually studied or trained professionally in those disciplines. So he points out those requirements which was required to become a good knight errant, but he does not recognize that he was not trained. He was very much like the beginning stage of Corchuelo, thinking, and I can overpower you. I can fence as good as you do. But he wasn't a theologian or a swimmer, professional swimmer, or astrologer, etc. But he considers himself a good combination of these practices.
So this is this long paragraph on 602 to 603 that you're referring to, Alec, if people want to know the disciplines that Quixote says he studied here.
Mathematician, yeah, all that.
So that's interesting. So I see how you're connecting these two passages, but I want to ask you about this. So there's the other passage you referred to is on 614. Sancho says, by my faith, Mr. B.A., if you take my advice, you won't go challenging anyone to a fencing duel ever again, but to wrestling or pitching the bar because you've got the youth and the strength for that. So the idea is youth and strength prevail in these less skill-intensive physical feats, athletic feats, whereas science prevails, it seems, in fencing, if you've got it. And you're saying Quixote on 602 to 603 is a bit like Corchuelo in that he's full of a sense of his own ability. He's arrogantly self-assured about his ability about his mastery of these skills or crafts or disciplines. It's a combination of them on 602 to 603 that surely he's not in fact mastered.
Right. And the paragraph slightly above in page 614, the brute strength is overcome by skill. So in the discipline of fencing, those who actually practice and acquire skill would overpower somebody who thinks they can be good just by fighting hard without training.
So this is what I want to ask you. I mean, this is an interesting comparison, the comparison of Quixote's mindset to that of Corchuelo. But it seems like Quixote has elements of both Corchuelo's mindset and the MA's mindset. I'll tell you why. On the one hand, I mean, the Corchuelo is saying before they duel, there's no point to studying fencing. I can beat you despite having not studied. And it seems like the reasoning or the rationale for his saying that is, well, studying doesn't help. Being good at fencing is not a matter of studying. It's a matter of, I don't know, talent, strength, agility, something like that, conditioning. Quixote seems to be saying on 602 to 603 that being a good knight errant is a matter of study. It's just that he thinks he's mastered these skills when in fact he hasn't. What do you think? Is that?
That's the irony. I think, first of all, the subject of knight errantry itself seems to be created. This combination is not a real life job. And if you break down the requirements into being a good astrologer as well as a theologian, etc., it might make sense to this particular imaginary job description. But specific to each of these, Don Quixote, arguably, he's not, he didn't go to school to study theology or astronomy. So he might be right in you should study well in these disciplines, but he doesn't recognize that he is not the person who's particularly skilled in these disciplines. I mean, he's read books about how other supposed knight errants behave, but that's different from if he actually discusses theology with a theologian.
Right. It seems like he thinks that reading those books, that was studying all these subjects.
Right.
So, okay, so let me just try to summarize the differences as I'm hearing them from you, Alec. Corchuelo, the BA, says fencing is not being good at it is not a matter of study. It's, give me a shot. The MA says fencing is a matter of, being good at fencing is a matter of study. I've studied the science. I'll demonstrate how much better I am than you. He, in fact, has studied and demonstrates his superiority in fencing. Quixote makes up a kind of master discipline, knight errantry, that entails the study of all these subdisciplines, none of which we're convinced he's really mastered. And so even if he's defending the value of all these multifarious kinds of learning, he's invented the larger category to which he says they belong, or the larger way of life, knight errantry, or he's derived it from books and imagined that this is actually a kind of university study or something like that. And he's mistaken that he, in fact, possesses mastery of all those subdisciplines. Is that right?
Right.
Okay.
That's what I'm thinking.
Okay, thank you. The comparison is, getting more and more complicated between the BA, MA episode and Quixote to figure how he compares to these characters involved. Charles, go ahead.
I'm looking at this from a slightly different angle, and that is, if I remember correctly, in the Renaissance, an accomplished gentleman was expected to know poetry and song, as well as being an accomplished writer or fighter or something like that. And so here, he doesn't come out and say it, but I think it's a showing how somebody should have all these accomplishments, or that's not the right word, but all these attributes in order to be a complete man.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So the argument over the value of, say, poetry or fencing, those are arguments over very narrow disciplines. I mean, poetry is fairly broad, but it's not as capacious as what you're describing, Charles, namely being a Renaissance man and the way that we think of that. Quixote's description of what it takes to be a knight errant is much more similar to a kind of full conception of how to be a well-rounded Renaissance man. It's more like a description of a way of life. Whether being a Renaissance man includes, being a jurist, a theologian, an herbalist, knowing how to swim, being an astrologer, knowing mathematics, on and on and on. Who knows? But there's at least something kind of fuller and more like the characterization of a good life in what Quixote is defending than what's at issue in these other discussions. Is that the thought?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Then there's a minor thought. And that is at the bottom of page, very bottom, page 605, I think, or 4. Just a minute, I'll find it. Oh, once again, I had it marked. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Once again, we've got a 609. She's the most beautiful woman that any man has ever seen. Once again, we've got a beautiful woman that's more beautiful than anybody else in the story. And that's in the sort of the for whatever it's worth category. But
This is Quiteria who's being described here.
yes, I
Yeah.
believe so.
Yeah, the Duchess is apparently a looker too. Go figure. It seems like it's the price of admission for at least most women in this story, that they be more beautiful than any woman we've ever seen or heard of. April, go ahead.
I was struck in this passage about fencing itself, because fencing, as far as I know, is a sport where you have two opponents and they both know that they're in the sport, right? There's two people that are have the fencing foils. They even mention in here the button, the safety button on the foil. So it was just interesting. So it's like play fighting in a way where no one gets hurt. And then it almost seems like the master of fencing was kind of, he was doing things like tickling, whatever, what did it say? Made him kiss the foil as if it were a holy relic, and, twirled his cassock and things like that. So it almost seemed like a demonstration of power between the two. And I found that just a really interesting thing compared to Don Quixote, who thinks he is a fight. Like, he goes into battles with people who don't know that he's battling them. Whereas the fencing display was more a stage sport fight, that he was like, oh, let me umpire this so that I can be the truth of who's better at fencing. And that really, the fencing part of it, the sport of the fight and the staging of a fight, really struck me more than anything else about that passage.
I mean, that's really interesting. So, and I want your help thinking about this. So it seems to me, I think this is right. Cervantes himself got in trouble for dueling in his own life. So I think fencing, when it was practiced, it was a sport. It was, umpired, and the buttons were on and so forth, and nobody was supposed to deliberately attempt to injure the other fencer. But it was also a duel. It was kind of like a means of settling disputes, even if not, I'm not sure it was legal, depending on who was doing it. In any case, so you're saying, April, that there's a difference between the kind of battling that Quixote often does and fencing, in that the kind of battling that Quixote often does is without a clear understanding between the two parties that this is play fighting, that there's rules governing it, a kind of convention that marks this as not war, but a kind of mock war where you're demonstrating skill, basically as real fighting rather than sport. Sports involve a kind of agreement between everyone involved that there's a boundary around the kinds of actions that are allowed and the kind that are not, and everybody understands when the sport begins and when it ends. Whereas in war or fighting, not so. Everything's in bounds, and you don't directly engage the sensibilities of the person you're attacking in order to make sure they know the rules and so forth. Am I getting the distinction that you're after?
That's part of it. And I also feel that when I've been reading this, I feel like so many aspects are like a play. Even like this quick turn of, oh, new characters riding down the road, here's what's happening with them. And I feel like fencing is yet another staged combat in this play that I'm watching. So it feels less like a story, other stories that I've read, but more like a theater performance all in with different acts.
That's very interesting. I mean, we're going to see theater pops up 3 or 4 times in the reading for today. It was in the reading for last time with Quixote's being attacked by and then trying to attack. And anyway, that troupe of actors. So maybe this is another moment in which we're getting a kind of affinity between theater and warfare, or like a kind of theater that approaches combat. But this is what I want your help thinking with, April, because I don't know if the distinction that you're drawing is quite so neat between fencing and what Quixote takes himself to be doing. Because I think 2 different reasons. What Quixote does is quite theatrical often, even if he's mistaken that the people he's attacking are in on the sport of it or the convention, right? So it seems like the first way is that knights errant, they have a code. They only attack certain people and not others. They have formal means of engaging one another when they want to quarrel about something. Quixote often stands and declares himself to the people he's going to attack, even if they have no idea what he's saying, because he's trying to play a sport effectively with someone who has no idea that they're on the field. Likewise, his inspiration is books of chivalry, which by virtue of genre conventions, I take it, and the designation of roles for different characters, make the combat involved in them really legible and tidy. They're not like warfare in some kind of messy sense in which you just do your best to kill the other person no matter what, or defend yourself. The people slot into very defined roles. If you're a giant, we know which side you're on. If you're a kind of damsel in distress, we know where you stand. The occasions for fighting are very governed by genre convention, and likewise how you go about doing it. So there's something sport-like, I think, about the fighting that Quixote takes himself to be doing, and that goes on in the novels that he takes to be his inspiration. So I just want your help in thinking through this further. There are no buttons on the end of the blades, but nevertheless, who fights with whom and in what manner, it seems, is fairly prescribed ahead of time and supposed to be known by the parties engaged. So how do you think about this?
I think you're exactly right. I think it's a lot like fencing in that sense, where the roles, the opponents, the offense, defense, who's winning. I think Don Quixote is, it's unclear if he wins his battles. Sometimes it's just blown off. Sometimes it's just all mistakes that happen, but there are definite connections between this fencing and what Don Quixote does. And as you say, the combat is pretty tidy and the roles are defined ahead of time. And there's a code, there's a rule for the knights errant and how they engage, just like fencing, there are rules. You can't I don't fence, but you probably can't you wear helmets, right? In a sport today, you probably can't poke somebody in the eye, etc. So there's a combination. I think there is some theater in that sense, it is staged in a way with Don Quixote's knight errantry actions. I would agree they're very similar.
Okay, so I'm just gonna lay out what I take to be some of the basic characteristics that you're saying they share, or maybe that I'm thinking that they share. So there's a theatrical element. It's combat, but it's also theater. There's fixed roles and fixed rules, and a kind of presumption that everybody involved understands what they're up to. There's very little taking by surprise, at least intentionally. People know the score. It's also, there's a testing involved. It seems like fencing, when you do it, it's for the purpose of determining who's better, or determining who's better on this occasion, rather than for the sake of saving your own life and killing the other guy, or disabling the other guy. So there's testing involved. It's combat as testing, combat as theater. All those things, I take it with this connection you're drawing between them, April, seem like they're live ways of understanding what Quixote is doing and what's going on in the novels that he is drawing inspiration from. So I actually think this is like a nice comparison that's useful for reflecting on what Quixote is up to in general. Like it expands our thinking about what's going on with him. Thanks, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to give a shout out to Charles. The notion of Quixote as some sort of Renaissance man, parody is such a great image. I'm trying to wrestle with that one. But the thing I wanted to talk about is a little bit of a tangent, which is as we talked about poetry and fencing and knight errantry, the question of, so how do you know what good looks like? Okay, in fencing, it's clear. Good is about winning. Okay, with poetry, I couldn't tell you even how to evaluate the poems that they have in the book in terms of whether they're good or bad or parody or anything in between. Knight errantry is kind of a funny combination. You have all these little skills, which at one level you could say what looks good, but it doesn't seem to have any particular relation to whether Quixote is successful in being a knight, because that seems that's more of, am I living by the code properly? The individual victories or failures or fiascos, of which there are more, don't mean that he's failing in his quest. It's, it's the, am I living the code right? More of like kind of almost like a process. But that, or no, it's not a process. It's the right living, which again is, maybe there's a mixture here, or there's some strong markers a la fencing, and then there's some utterly indefinable things a la poetry.
So this is great. One of the first things we hear about the priests, the barber, and Quixote is that they sit around talking about which knights errant are the greatest, right? So this topic of how you excel at knight errantry is with us really early on in the novel, and I think the fact that Quixote is comparing himself to famous knights errant and giving speeches about how to do it well and what the good of knight errantry is means this is on his mind a lot, Steve. And I think the difficulties that we might have in assessing how you do it well, I think you've laid out nicely. So how do you assess a knight errant, or what does it mean?
Is it how many giants you've slain, or is it how have you comported yourself in battle?
Right. So it seems like on the one hand, there's this component of just discipline. Do you follow the rules? Do you sleep in the right way? Do you not pay for the right things and pay in the right way to the right people? Have you undergone or adhered to the rules of courtesy that govern relations between yourself and other knights errant, or yourself and Dulcinea? Are you performing feats of madness? I mean, I take it you can do that really well, but it's more like something you just have to, a kind of series of boxes you have to tick. It's a discipline. And then there's the question of how impressive are the feats that you've accomplished? What's your body count? Have you descended to have you lifted the bulls that I forget where the Knight of the Forest, so-called, said he was lifting bulls, these immense stones, or descending to the depths of pits and so forth. So maybe I take it your thought is, with the demonstration of fencing, we're meant to think about this tougher question: what is it to be good at knight errantry? It's really clear with fencing, you beat the other guy. With knight errantry, there is the beating of the other guy, that's part of it, but I mean, if the speech that Alec gave is to be believed, there's all these disciplines you have to master, and how do you demonstrate that you're a master of all those disciplines, astrology and being a jurist and theology. I mean, who's the best theologian? Well, Aquinas, but demonstrating that is really difficult.
Who's the greatest Renaissance man? I mean, this is one of those things where the mixture of skill and how you evaluate them and from what perspective. And
right. So maybe with the fencing episode, we're supposed to raise this question and say, Quixote doesn't have it so easy. Yeah, thank you. Larry, go ahead.
Steve, what's really interesting to me about the subject that you just raised is that it's not until Don Quixote is in the presence of the Duchess, the Duke and the Duchess, that he actually feels like a real knight. I mean, we're well beyond the 50-yard line in this novel and so forth, and all that he's undergone. His self-affirmation is reinforced by how he's treated by the Duke and Duchess.
So this is a really common feature of ways of life or disciplines in which demonstration of mastery is ambiguous, or it's hard to know how to assess it. Imposter syndrome is really common. So Quixote, this is one of the reasons that being honored is actually of importance, has psychological importance for Quixote. He's got imposter syndrome until that point, which is very strange for a guy who's almost certainly an imposter, at least in some sense. Yeah, I want to talk about that moment. I mean, well, should we just talk about it now? I mean,
I didn't mean to jump ahead. It was just
no,
a
that's
thought
fine.
that, yeah.
I see how it's right. That's the kind of thing that the MA, from which the MA should not suffer. Namely, worry that he's not really a good fencer. He feels like a good fencer when he beats when he beats the BA. He demonstrates the good of his craft. Quixote doesn't have that, so I think that's like a nice reading of what's going on with that moment, Larry. Any other thoughts about that line? So this is skipping ahead to question 8, but I think it's apt. This is on 693. Quixote, along with Sancho, are being welcomed by the servants of the Duke and the Duchess with great ceremony. And we hear that was the first day when Quixote was fully convinced that he was a real knight errant, not a fantasy one, seeing himself treated in the same way as he'd read that such knights used to be treated in centuries past. Just thoughts about this scene, this line. Yeah, Steve.
I mean, this is, to me, like a Pygmalion moment. Okay, the difference between a flower girl and a duchess is how she's treated. Okay, the whole question of, is he a knight does he feel a knight in the way he's treated as a knight? So it's not the actions we were just talking about. It's not all the individual skills. For all that we just talked about, that the essence of the question is how people treat him and how people see him, and therefore how he sees himself. And it talks about the power of expectations in terms of how he can develop and fulfill himself. It's one more piece of that puzzle that we talked about.
I mean, how should we think about this, Steve? So your last comment made me think there might be such a thing as being a good knight errant, but it's so hard to know what that would entail that into the sense of uncertainty, maybe recognition by other people serves as the a kind of nice substitute.
There's no such thing as a Zen knight errant. Okay, if the tree falls in the forest, or if the knight errant does all these wonderful deeds and no one knows about them, then maybe he isn't a full knight errant. One of the important pieces of the puzzle is, everyone's got to know that the tree fell in the forest, that the giant was slain, that you entered the cave and showed all the courage in the world. If no one writes the book, who cares?
There is a good deal of recognition winning or recognition seeking that's built into being a knight errant as Quixote understands it, beyond like having a sage record your deeds, which I take it maybe that is essential to being a knight errant, I don't know. But seeking the recognition of your beloved through this highly staged process, going through these rituals of recognition with the people, especially the knights that you defeat in battle, so that they'll recognize your superiority and submit to you and go present themselves before your beloved and so forth. But I take it you're saying it's not quite any of those forms of recognition that are essential for feeling yourself to be a knight errant. It's someone doing what the Duke and Duchess do, celebrating you as a knight errant. That's what gives you conviction that you're doing it right. Is that right?
And that's a stepping stone. I mean, again, I don't know how the story ends, but to me, that's a stepping stone on the way to getting recognition from Dulcinea in terms of what the ultimate, like, because the ultimate recognizer of what you've done is the person who personifies beauty and truth. And that's Dulcinea in this case.
Great. Okay, so I mean, I think this is nice for enabling us to place this episode involving the Duke and Duchess along a chain of elements in the novel in which Quixote and Sancho, or Quixote especially, is being recognized or seeking recognition as a knight errant. From, we know he's famous at this point. His book is being read. That's why these people are recognizing him. He seeks recognition from the people he defeats and from the people he challenges and so forth. And he seeks recognition from Dulcinea. And I take it, Steve, you're saying that one is the ultimate kind of recognition, but the kind of capstone recognition, but all these others are part of the same game.
Right, including the fact that he challenges people to recognize Dulcinea as the most beautiful person in the world, sight unseen. There's another aspect of the place that the recognition plays in the gradations of, again, the quality of his knight errantry.
So we're very close to the thought about knight errantry involving theater, right? Another, giving a spectacle or testing where you come out and you prove yourself to whoever is watching, as happens in fencing, that you're the best. The recognition is kind of the equivalent of the thing that crowns your success, or the applause of the audience or something like that for Quixote. So I think this is tying together a number of the things that we've been
Well, it is,
about.
and just one last thing, and I'll shut up, but the theater is nothing without the audience. Putting on a play, I mean, you ask anyone who's been in theater, okay, it's one thing to rehearse and feel good about it. That is not in any way, shape, or form the same thing about what happens when you're on stage and you get the recognition of the audience and you have the interaction of the audience. That's part of the process and part of the reward.
That's fair. Cindy, go ahead.
I see it a little differently. I think this paragraph is really unique, though there may have been some buildup to it where we've had these scenes where Don Quixote seems to talk sense for a larger part of what he's saying than to talk nonsense. When we started the book, it was mostly nonsense, I think. And then several times in this part, we've had people say, wow, that was actually pretty good till he got to the end part. But it really is the first, I don't know if this is the right word, the first example of interiority, of what he's actually feeling. Through this book, he's kind of like, I mean, let me put it this way. If someone up to now had said to him, you aren't a real knight errant, you're a fantasy knight errant, wouldn't you have expected one of those long speeches we've been getting about I am and blah, 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 and what do you mean and what are you talking about? And here you not only have it say, you have him saying it. So it's almost, in, I don't know, we're at page 693, so I'm probably forgetting some, but it seems to me one of the strongest and very different thing of all of a sudden him, the whole idea that he might think he was an imposter, I don't think was here earlier. And like I said, maybe he kind of moved us to it because of these speeches in part 2, where we're seeing kind of almost, was that wisdom that just came out of Don Quixote's mouth or close to it? But this is really the first time you get a sense of not what Don Quixote is emoting or saying or doing, but what he's actually feeling, and that he is feeling that he's felt a vulnerability about whether he really is a knight errant. So that's what I think is unique about this. To me, it was very different. than what we've said, and it does, it actually, it gives him more depth of character than he's had, at least for me up until now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for me to imagine many people disagreeing with that reading, Cindy. This is a moment of vulnerability that Quixote will never allow himself to, a kind of vulnerability he'll never allow himself to display publicly when somebody challenges him on his madness. If deep down he really thinks, oh, I've been a fantasy knight errant all along, well, that's surely not a face he's shown to the world. I mean, the closest precedent that I can think is one that we talked about earlier on page 216, if you want to have a look, where Quixote clarifies that he says, for what I want of Dulcinea del Toboso, she is as good as the most exalted princess in the world. I'm doing what all poets do with the women they write about, namely embellishing, because I'm playing the part of a lover and attributing to her characteristics that she doesn't really have, but you need to do that in order to, you imitate lovers in order to be a lover, and maybe you imitate knights errant in order to be a knight errant, he says, I think in the same chapter somewhere. That's not to say he's there, he doesn't say, I'm a fantasy knight errant and I don't feel like a knight errant, but he is saying there out loud, I'm faking it to some extent until I make it. So this is in a continuum with that, but this is, the note on 693 is far more dramatic along those lines. He's saying, I felt like a fantasy knight errant all along. There's a serious degree of difference there. Any other thoughts about either this line on 693 or how it compares with the question about demonstrating one's excellence, proficiency, mastery that arose in our discussion of fencing, the way it compares to the assessment of poetry and of knight errantry, and one's ability to, or one's mastery of those things? Any thoughts about how, so there was a demonstration of mastery that I think is parallel in the last week's reading, which is Sancho's demonstration of his fine palate, right? So that was another case where there's just like a skill that he can prove that he's got by doing a neat little trick, proving he knows the vintage of the wine that he's been given. And likewise, the story he tells about his ancestors with the leathern key, or the key with the iron key with the leathern thong, they tasted that in the cask of wine. Everybody laughs at them, and yet they're proven to have the amazing skill that they purported to have, because you can find the key, and that's how you know these guys are great wine tasters. You've got the key, it's the proof, right? Any thoughts? I mean, either what that episode might have meant when it arose in light of this connection to demonstration of mastery or proficiency, or how we should think about it in relation to these questions we've been talking about in relation to the episode with the fencers. Okay, then let's draw a relationship between this scene and what we've got in chapters 19 to 22. So I asked with 2B, is there any good reason that Cervantes might have included this duel between the BA, Corchuelo, and the MA within the larger story about Quiteria, Camacho, and Basilio? And from what you all have been saying, April's thought about the comparison between fencing and theater. I think we've got a start on this. A convincing piece of theater is at the center of the Quiteria, Camacho, the story of Quiteria, Camacho, and Basilio, namely, Basilio's virtuosic trick. This it's kind of like a performance of a stunt. What do you think about either the connection between fencing or the demonstration of mastery and Basilio's theatrical feat of trickery. Is there some connection there that's meaningful? Or, I mean, there's a literal play included in chapter 22. It seems a style of play that it's like a morality play, which was pretty common in, I think, in villages around this period. This is traveling troops like the kind that we saw in the previous chapter, where one person's a knight, another's a death, another is Cupid, another is an emperor, and so forth. All these allegorical figures present a fairly morally simple pageant. We get one of those at the wedding festivities for Camacho and Quiteria. Is there some comparison between Basilio's feat of trickery, which, if it's theater, belongs to a very different genre, and the play, the morality play that we get as part of the wedding festivities? So those are my two questions about theater in relation to the duel and well, these three things: the duel, Basilio's trick, and then the morality play at the wedding festivities. Alec, go ahead.
All right, when I raised the hand, it's before you proposed those specific questions, but the way I saw how they connected is from a slightly different angle. I see mainly a strong comparison on how these characters accept defeat. When what's his name? Corchuelo was defeated, he recognizes, okay, I accept the truth that what I wasn't willing to see before, that skills were better, and when my opponent was trained, it was better, and they became as good friends as before, even better. That was the outcome. And when Camacho, he recognizes that he was initially he was tricked, and then he accepts that, and then he went on to partying, saying, you know, it's not my loss. I didn't get this woman who doesn't love me anyways. So he goes on to celebrate. I'm rich still, so there's still things to celebrate. His life is still good. But whenever Don Quixote is defeated, the explanation is always enchantment and something that's working against him, and there's no fault of his own or other person's skill or the lack of logic, etc., that overpower him. It's mostly imaginary reasons that they use to convince, he uses to convince himself. So for me, when seeing these different comparisons, it's mainly reminding me of how normal people approach defeat. It might accept them in good ways or bad ways, but not imaginary reasons. So that's mainly what I think.
Okay, I actually think there's like a really deep question in the middle of what you're saying, Alex. So I'm going to try to pull it out. I think you're pointing to this, but in part you're inspiring in me. It's related to question 3D. What should we make of Quixote's intervention to stop the fight and to make peace between the parties? The Quixote and the priest, it seems like, take part in this. So I really like the frame you've given for this. For the reasons that we were talking about in contrasting fencing with poetry. Interestingly, Quixote was talking about contests of poetry in the previous chapter, but where you get a first prize, a second prize, a third prize. So that's one way of deciding who's the best, but even those were equivocal. The first prize always goes to the person who's got social connections or something like that. In any case, so fencing, it's really neat. Likewise, sports, they're great for this. You know, somebody wins, somebody loses. It's so long as things have been umpired or refereed in the right way, and no cheating or whatever, justice is done. We just know by the outcome who was supposed to win, right? Quixote, you're saying, Alec, never accepts defeat. It's not something he does readily, at least. If he does it, he's always got an excuse as to why he was defeated. Some enchanter has messed with him, and basically the game was rigged in one way or another. The question of Camacho losing out to Basilio, I actually think this is like the central question about the story involving Quiteria, Camacho, and Basilio. How do you decide with whom Quiteria should go? And I take it the answer to that question looks different at different stages of the story. And why should she go with Basilio ultimately? Initially, it seems like, well, wealth and Quiteria's father's decision wins the day. After Basilio's trick, it looks like, it's not clear to Camacho or his friends who should win. There's combat that's about to break out, but then these two kind of judge figures intervene with some kind of judgment, which itself is not the equivalent of like counting the score at the end of a fencing, a duel, or a sport or something like that. It's more like a kind of demonstration of the value of theology or philosophy or law or something like that. You need a judge, somebody to exercise a humanistic skill to reason their way through this, to make sure everybody's convinced that one of these people should be Quiteria's lawful husband and the other one should not be. And so what are the arguments that are given? It's something like, well, Basilio paves the way. He makes sure that Quiteria accepts him as her husband, swearing that she's not doing it out of complacence or out of deception, but sort of under the right circumstances, in the right mindset. And likewise, she makes him swear that he's not doing this out of suffering, that he's of sound mind when he agrees to be her husband. Quixote cites their vows as having happened before God as a kind of means of settling the contest between Basilio and Camacho, as if God is the umpire or something like that, who's witnessed the definitive, goal scored or point struck or something like that. And likewise, the priest has his own reasons, which I don't have in my memory. But I think this is actually like just a really nice way of framing the right question to ask about this episode. Why does it come out the way that it does? Should it come out that way? Are the reasons that Quixote and the priest, and maybe even Basilio and Quiteria and Camacho with his rationalizations give, are those definitive? Are those the equivalent of like the umpire saying, the match is over, this guy wins, this guy loses? So I think we have to sort through all that, and you've given us like a really nice frame for thinking about how we should think about it. This is neither an episode in which one person definitively wins because that's how the rules of the game work, nor is it an episode in which one person loses like Quixote does, but claims, well, and it was all rigged, enchanters, right? It's something that has elements of both of those, and I take it as up to us. One of the things I think Cervantes is doing with this episode is trying to get us to think about, is this just and right and good? And if so, why? What is it about this sequence of events that indicates that Basilio and Quiteria should be married rather than Camacho and Quiteria, or that there shouldn't be bloodshed or something like that? Any reaction to what I've just said? It's a long response to your framing, Alan.
I need some reminders about how the judges gave their opinions, but in my memory, I think this Basilio's, I think written here as his ingenuity, provided an opportunity to something where nobody really, it's like an overall happy ending for most people, even though Camacho didn't get his beautiful wife, he still celebrated because there's still things to celebrate. Quiteria, she seems to have married the person she loved, even though there's concern about poverty or what job her husband does, if that's sustainable. And Basilio, if he didn't perform this, then he would be somebody that I forgot if there was a character before in the multiple episodes of similar things where a girl liked the guy and it was given to or marry somebody else because of other reasons, and the guy becomes bitter afterwards. But he, through his quote unquote ingenuity, achieve that opportunity. And it seems like a moment where, you know, people say, if you're trying to decide between A and B, you flip a coin and cover it, but before you reveal it, you probably have told yourself, I wish it was one of the other, one or the other. So seems like Kitaria didn't mind this outcome, and that's led to an overall happy ending for most people.
Okay, so I take it now there are 2 or 3 versions of this question that I think you're are packed into what you're saying. There's the question, is Basilio rightfully married to Quiteria after this display? That's one question. There's another question like, should Camacho contest the marriage? There's another question, is Quiteria now well settled? Has she chosen the right guy? Should she be, you know, pleased with this match? And I take it there are different criteria you've appealed to in answering those various questions. So we might say, Basilio does deserve to be married to Quiteria because because of his feat of ingenuity and trickery. You could say Quiteria, by virtue of her not contesting the marriage afterward, has revealed her preferences for Basilio over Camacho, even if she married him in strange circumstances. The fact that she's okay with it afterward is an indication that she should be, or she wants to be, with Basilio rather than Camacho. So there are a lot of questions, I take it, that are ambiguous that get settled somehow by some means in this episode. So I just want to turn this over to everybody. Are these questions settled in a manner that seems well justified, satisfying? Is the judgment of the various parties involved responding to the right things? You know, you might ask, was Basilio's deception well justified? Was it right? Is the marriage legitimate or illegitimate, as some onlookers cry, because it was predicated on deception? Is Quixote's claim as to why the marriage must be recognized a reasonable one? These are all, I think, up in the air in this episode. Larry, go ahead.
I have to say that I was deeply unsettled by this story, by this episode. I feel that all the characters involved in this story should be questioned and are wrong in terms of their judgment. I think that Basilio, I was thinking about him, and Don Pedro, both deceptive con artists, and less than above board in their intentions. I think that Camacho acquiesces way too soon to accepting the marriage of Basilio and Quiteria. I think that Don Quixote's defense of Basilio and Quiteria is morally wrong.
Why? Can you just talk us through it? I mean, presumably some people disagree with this, so can you just give some reasons as to how you would proceed?
Well, regarding Don Quixote, the rationale that he used to justify Basilio and Quiteria is, it seems to me that if nobody is hurt, if the beloved is not hurt in the end, that the ends justify the means. And I think that in the end, Quiteria is hurt by her decision. I think it's a reflection of poor judgment on her part and a weakness in her character.
So, insofar as she, like, can you just characterize the weakness and the poor judgment? It's like, you shouldn't agree to marry your childhood sweetheart when he's dying just because he's dying. Because why? What's the character?
But he wasn't dying. It was a ruse.
Do you think she knew that?
I don't. Well, we're told, I think, in the narrative that she had no part in the con.
Right.
but I think in the setting that she is sort of forced into taking his hand because of the situation, the pathos of the situation in which she perceives him as dying.
So, I mean,
In other words, she's forced by the priest in a way, and she's forced by the bystander, the other guests, the other witnesses to this event.
yeah, she has to swear to, I mean, to me, the idea that this is dishonors or discredits her. So you refer to this line on 629 from Quixote. He says, as in war, it is lawful and customary to use tricks and stratagems to defeat the enemy. So also in amorous conflict and rivalry, it is considered permissible to resort to ruses and contrivances to attain the desired end, so long as they do not discredit or dishonor the loved one. And I take it, Larry, you were saying, this does discredit Quiteria. And the reason you're giving now seems to me intuitive, but it seems to discredit, maybe to dishonor Quiteria, but to discredit Basilio, in that it seems like a violation of her autonomy, maybe a mistrust of her
Yes.
judgment, to pressure her in front of a crowd and under contrived circumstances to give her hand in marriage. It's like there's a false pretext under which she's.
That's exactly right.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's 7:31 my time. When we come back from break, Karen, you will be up and we'll be on the same topic. So see you all in 15 minutes. And get us started. Okay, so just a reminder, the topic on the table is, it's a kind of a woolly one with this transition that Alec gave us. In thinking about just declaring winners and losers, or having clear criteria for determining how to think about, what's good and what's bad, how should we think about the outcome. In various episodes, there was the duel is settled very clearly. The loser admits that he was in the wrong. There's Quixote never admitting that he's in the wrong. And then we have this, that's a nice frame for this question of how to think about Basilio's trick and its apparent success. There's been a determination that Quiteria will be with Basilio. Is it right? How do they get there? How should we think about it? What's who should have won? Who should have lost? What's good and what's bad in this episode, and so forth. Okay, Karen, up to you.
Should have unmuted sooner. So I apologize in advance. I'm not going to answer your exact question. What I would like to do instead is, I just cannot resist pointing out Don Quixote's hypocrisy in this whole issue. Because, on page 31, in this particular situation, he, right after saying basically the ends justify the means, he goes on to say, and for people in love to marry is the most excellent end of all, always bearing in mind that love's worst foe is hunger, and blah, 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 because love is pure joy, delight, and happiness, even more so when the lover is in possession of the loved one. He goes through this whole thing, which has been his reaction to almost all the love stories where, the star-crossed lovers who can't marry end up marrying the one they love. But back on page 611, he had this very extended tirade about how ridiculous it is if everybody married the person they love, said Don Quixote, parents would lose their power to marry their children when and to whom they should, and blah, blah, blah. And then he goes on to say, because love and fancy easily blind the eyes of the understanding, which are so necessary when making decisions about settling down in life. And with marriage, there is such a danger of making mistakes, and great circumspection and the special help of heaven are needed to make the right choice. And then he goes on and on and on. So, earlier, just a couple chapters earlier, he said, wow, you can't just marry for love. This is a really important decision, and it's a lifelong decision, an inseparable appendage that lasts as long as life itself. And then all of a sudden he's, on page 631, he's once again in this situation where, the two lovers have come together and he's saying, oh, isn't it excellent because love conquers all. The people, the people who should marry each other are the people who love each other. So I find that really interesting.
Yeah, I actually think you are answering my question, Karen. It's just sort of, this is an answer that's in the background of like a larger answer to the question, or a more direct answer to the question. So the question is, how should we think about this outcome? And one possible answer to that is, well, Quixote gives us a justification as to why it's right and good that Basilio and Quiteria end up together. Namely, isn't it great when people who love each other end up married? That's a kind of outcome that excuses any deceptions that they might have undertaken in order to achieve it. But I take it you're giving us reason to doubt that we should accept Quixote's justification on its face, given that he seems to undermine it himself 25 pages earlier. So what we've heard from the friends.
Well, if we were relying on his prudent mind and justification, yes, I would definitely doubt it in light of what he has said earlier. That doesn't mean that somebody couldn't necessarily believe that was to be true.
Right, but we've got an imperfect vehicle for delivering this one consideration as to why it's good that Basilio and Quiteria ended up together. And so I think that's material to our thinking, like who's the right judge here of whether this outcome is a good one. I take it Quixote has done something to discredit himself. So
he has, yes.
Steve, go ahead, and then Cindy.
Well, and this is going back to what I understood Alex you talking about. I mean, Quixote is a particularly imperfect judge for proper outcomes. Considering for himself, the answer is either it came out the way I wanted to, or it's an enchanter. So again, we have an example where it came out to where he wanted it to, or we can impute that it did because he provides its blessing. Had it somehow come out with the other option, which is, so he's putting his blessing on top of something he perceives to be the right answer, which therefore does not require a more convoluted, devious answer. It can just go to love conquers all, or anything that the means justify the ends when it has to do with love finding the happy ending. I don't think this is one that's meant to be that neat and tidy. I think that the reason why the question can turn into a infinitely multi-part one, and why something like what Karen pointed out, which is there's inherent conflict and hypocrisy in our star character, is that the core question is one where I don't think there is a right wrong. I mean, Larry talked about the many things about the way this comes together and the behavior that people undertake that would make you question it. What's interesting, or another thing is, what's interesting to me is that it gets accepted. I mean, this is one where, having gone through all these convolutions and with the potential for it unraveling 27 different ways, the fact that everybody accepts the answer and moves on is in some ways the most noteworthy part of it.
It does seem like Quixote has something to do with that, if he's not the only reason. His intervention stops the violence from getting out of hand, it seems. So I take it Karen has given us like a fairly local reason for thinking Quixote's explanation as to why it's good that Basilio and Quiteria have ended up together is not something we should put full credit in. Steve, you've given us a more global reason, namely Quixote often cites principles, but then when something goes not according to his liking, he comes up with a rationalization as to why it happened that way. He says enchanters did it, I'm not to blame.
Which is a very human thing to do, by the way.
So he's just
he's a crazy guy doing it, but he's doing something that's very human.
so he's an imperfect judge. He can cite principles, but he can cite principles on both sides of a question. It seems pretty masterfully. And I mean, let me just ask, because I think this will probably stir up some thoughts from other people, Karin and Steve. Is your sense that Quixote changes the side that he's on of this question? Because, I mean, here's my intuition. I just want to know if you just read it the same way, and if so, maybe there's no question here. If not, maybe there's an interpretive question. It's like in the moment of the conflict, he sees an opportunity to do what a knight errant does, to protect the wishes of a woman who's sworn herself before God. So it's like holy ritual points in one direction, the idea of being coming to the rescue points in one direction, the idea of being a peacemaker, displaying the by the might of his arm or the threat of it, making peace between warring parties. So he needs a principle according to which he's doing the right thing, and he's kind of carried away by the theater of it, and that's why he's ends up defending the marriage. Do you read it that way, or is what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I see that again. The higher value for him is the chivalric value. The one that he enunciates earlier, 20 pages earlier, is, we'll call it the non-knight errant value, which probably everybody else would agree to, which is you can't let the kids do this.
Mm-hmm. Karin, you have similar thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think we sometimes hear him talking as the sort of sane and sagacious, person, wise, through years of experience person that he is, which he did in the earlier section. And then other times he's just carried away by emotion. I can't think of a better word to say. It just reminds me of the metaphor that's used sometimes about logic and emotion is the elephant. Like, we're driving an elephant, and we're the small driver, like our brain is the small driver on the elephant, but the elephant really drives us because that's all the emotion and feeling that we have in a situation. I didn't explain that very well, but
I think I get it. The
so
idea
we're
is-
but it's but it's the fact that we think we're controlling that elephant, but we're not. It runs away with us because we get carried away by the emotion and the feeling in the situation. And he seems to get carried away.
So Quixote thinks that he's citing principles as to what's allowed in struggles over courtship and why people who fall in love should be with one another. But really, his emotion is driving his rational faculty. He cites these principles because he just wants to, because it's a dramatic moment that he gets.
Well, because it's logical. It's logical to cite principles, but then he goes with his gut, his feelings.
Thank you. Cindy, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Don Quixote's response is just really, he's responding emotionally in the moment. He starts out, they give him this description of Basilio, who has all these great talents, like he's a great pitcher, a splendid wrestler. At the very beginning, he goes, well, he should have all the women, including Guinevere, even if Lancelot was around. And then on this next paragraph, he's saying, well, everybody, if every girl were allowed to pick who she married, she just picked the cutest guy walking down the block or something. So he vacillates, and I think when he does this speech, he's at 629 about love and war are one and the same. He's just responding to what's happening in the moment.
Yeah.
But there's a huge amount of deception in this, starting with as I understand it, they were like close when they were kids, and then it's in 610, Quitteria's father, who I don't know where he is at the wedding part. He doesn't seem to be as active in the wedding part. Decided not to allow Basilio into his house and to save being dogged by mistrust and suspicion, apparently everyone was already talking about their love affair, he arranged to have her be married to Camacho the Rich, okay? Camacho doesn't appear to know that there was this earlier relationship. So he's kind of being conned into this marriage to begin with. And then we have the whole scene with the, that Basilio pulled and Camacho again, what am I supposed to do here? And all of Basilio's friends are yelling, let him marry her, he's gonna die. And although she might not have known, I think there's a suggestion that he made sure all his friends were there to kind of, have people on his side with this. And then at the bottom of 628, the bride didn't give any signs of annoyance at the ruse. On the contrary, when she heard someone saying that the marriage being based on Ceci couldn't be considered valid, she reconfirmed it. So now she's really got what she wanted. And then Camacho at 629, what really makes the difference here is we've got Don Quixote with his brandishing this lance. And Quataria's disdain made such a mark on Camacho's mind that it obliterated the lady herself from his memory in an instant. And so the words of the priest worked on him. And then he said, everybody on his side decided it was Quataria's fickleness more than Basilio's ingenuity. And Camacho figured, well, if she already loved him ahead of time, she's going to continue to love him. So in a sense, Camacho's been the victim of like a con game, a series of con games. First marry her, now Basilio, now let him marry Basilio because he's going to die and it won't matter. So in the end, it actually works out pretty much better for Camacho. And I do have to say that my one thing I was going to add is she's really one up on this relationship. Because the minute he gives her any problem, she's got to say, you conned me into this. She can use that almost for the rest of their marriage, which I think is going to not be very happy. But the other thing about all this, and that this isn't the first time, and throughout all this is really a discussion of class in a sense. The poor people who don't learn to talk posh, but the educated people who do, the people who don't have the money and so can't marry the people they love, and the people who do. So there's an underlying, I think, theme of class in this that probably might have resonated more at the time than perhaps we can understand now. But
Okay, so there's a lot in there. Sorry, did you add, Cindy? I'm going to try to say it back to you. Tell me if I'm getting it all. The thought is, or the thoughts are, well, it works out pretty well for Camacho because he was being kind of duped all along, or he was in the dark about the relevant backstory. And he was in the dark about the ruse, and likewise, Quiteria reconfirms that she stands behind her marriage vow to Basilio. So that's an indication that maybe she was actually not in love with Camacho in any case, whether she realized it in the moment or it was true all along. Likewise, it works out pretty well for Quiteria because she's got leverage in the marriage. She can say always when conflicts arise, well, you tricked me into marrying you. So that settles whatever the argument is they're dealing with at the moment. And also it's just in a manner that appeals to our sensibilities that winning out, either love should triumph over wealth considerations, or somebody shouldn't get everything they want in life just by virtue of their class or their status. So the fact that Basilio, who seems virtuous in all these ways that make him attractive, he's a really good fencer and athlete and singer and so forth and guitar player, that's a triumph of deserving in a more human sense over class, or a less conventional sense over class. Have I got the thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know that much about Camacho's other qualities other than he's rich.
Right.
He might have a lot of, and I would say he probably does have some pretty good qualities because at the end he's like, hey, let's have a party, right? I mean, he doesn't, he backs his people off, lets them go, and continues, and he's very generous. I mean, it was the whole stew, what is the stew pan thing with Sancho through the whole thing is kind of like, look at this pan of stew I got. So his generosity, he was generous, he was liberal. In the end, he let it happen and he let the party go on. So actually, he's got some pretty good qualities too, in addition to money, which again, she's got a lot to say in the future.
That thought actually really recalls the content of the morality play that's performed during the
Right.
festivities. So along with wealth, there are all these virtues of handling wealth that come
Right.
along with wealth, one of which is largesse or liberality. Those are two of them. And I take it this is an expression of largesse, the whole wedding feast, and especially that Camacho lets it go forward after he's not even going to get married. He
Right.
displays a kind of equanimity. He accedes to
Right.
the disruption of his own plans, and he also spends lavishly on all these people even when he's not getting married. So he's virtuous in this narrow sense of using money well, right?
Right.
Um,
But I think a couple of times recently, Don Quixote has bemoaned the fact that you have to be wealthy in order to show largesse, to help people, and that and that it's so. And so I don't know. I don't think personally. I think probably she was better off with Camacho, but Camacho was better off without her.
Marjorie, was your hand up?
Yeah, I agree with Cynthia on that. Camacho, I think he dodged a bullet, as we'd say today. And Katrina, whatever her name is, made a horrible mistake. And I think there's a contradiction or another hint that maybe she did make a mistake in the next chapter when Don Quixote says love's worst foe is hunger and incessant need. And he encourages Basilico to apply himself to earning a living, or this isn't going to turn out well. So on page 631, and I took it as, oh yeah, this is doomed. This isn't going to end up well. So it made me go back and forth. Was, did this work out well? Did it not work out well? I think in the long run, it's not going to be good.
You don't think he's going to take Quixote's advice and
No, no.
make sure that he provides for the wife that he assumes to be the most virtuous woman in the world by earning enough money so that she doesn't become the prey of
Earning honest hug. No, I don't. But
Okay.
that's my opinion.
possible. Yeah. Any other thoughts about this? So this big question that do things work out well? Is there anything that seems unjustifiable, questionable here? What are the means by which the characters in the story reassure themselves that things are well? This is back to the question of how we decide in conflicts where there's not a clear scorekeeper or set of rules, whether the outcome is just and good. That's the larger question that Alec pointed us to. Any other thoughts about that as it involves Basilio, Quiteria, and Camacho? I'm pausing in part because I don't think we entirely put this to bed. I think we've heard thoughts on various sides of this question, none of which are directly in conflict, but come to opposite conclusions about what's worked out well and what's suspect in this whole process. Karin, and then Gary.
Well, I mean, in response to your question, I don't know that we have to decide if it's just and good, because the point is the conflict was resolved. I mean, they reached an agreement. They reached an amicable agreement. And that's usually what the goal is. in resolving a conflict. It's not necessarily to find the most just answer or the best answer. That would depend on different perspectives, but it's to ensure that the parties can walk away satisfied, and they did. So that seems like a positive.
So this, I actually think this is an answer to the question. Again, this is like, so the outcome is good insofar as nobody's killing each other at the end of it. The questions of justice should be subordinated to questions of civil order and peace and the conflict actually being resolved in this case. I mean, yeah, I think that's actually a substantive answer to the question. Regardless of whether we trust Quixote's justifications or think that Basilio did the right thing or that Camacho was taken for a ride, doesn't matter. Nobody's killing each other at the end of it. That's what's important. Yeah, it's an interesting take on this. Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if this has anything to do with justice or the appropriate outcome, but I couldn't help but notice the use of the word, in fact, twice, ingenuity. I think it's the first time ingenuity or ingenious has appeared since that first description of the ingenious Hidalgo that we were trying to figure out the very first week. And I have no idea if this is at all meaningful, but it just struck me as an interesting, perhaps just coincidence.
Do you think there's a good reason that they're both described as that? I guess he's calling it a coincidence. You're saying no, but sorry, go ahead.
I don't know. I mean, it sticks out like a sore thumb. I mean, it's got a line to itself. Basilio's yelling, no miracle, no miracle, ingenuity, ingenuity. And now we've got Don Quixote recognizing it as this is something, by the way, we shouldn't tell Putin about, that false flag operations are entirely appropriate. But I don't know, it just seemed like there must be something to it. I don't know precisely what it is.
Okay, I take it that's an invitation to the group to say, why is this word ingenuity being applied to Basilio as that he applies it to himself on 628? As I take it, he's kind of bragging.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is, I don't think there's any question he's ingenious as hell. And this may be the first time that you could use that to describe some principal role player in these series of stories as someone who gets what he wants through just cleverness and trickery and ingenuity.
Okay, I think there's a lot here. So now I'm going back through the episodes and thinking, oh, well, there was some ingenuity in The Tale of Inappropriate Curiosity, and there was some ingenuity with Zoraida and the captive, and with Dorotea and the priest and the barber trying to get one over on Quixote.
So maybe we got a theme here.
Maybe we got a theme here. Okay, so I'm sure there's going to be thoughts about this. Why is this word being applied to Basilio by himself when it's a variation of it has been applied to Quixote in the titles of both the first and second part? Cindy, go ahead.
So it may be, it's similar to ingenuity. When I was reading your question about how this compares to the other stories we've heard, and in my mind, Basilio, his character is such that he could very much end up like the husband in The Tale of Inappropriate Curiosity. Because that guy, it was another setup. Let's set this up so that I can test her virtue, right? There was a lot of deception involved in that story, and that, of course, did not end well for him or for anybody else in the story. But as to actual character, I think Basilio, and part of it is his ingenuity, but part of it is just his kind of manipulation, right? Is more like, if you look at all the other lovers, to me, he is more in character, separate and apart from what the love relationship is, like the husband in The Tale of Inappropriate Curiosity. And he is surrounded by a bunch of bros who all showed up at the wedding and said, let her marry him, let her marry him. So I could just see him doing that. And so in that sense, the ingenuity is not, I don't know that when we talk about the ingenious Hidalgo, that the ingenuity is quite so deceptive. I guess I think of it as more imaginative. And I think the ingenuity that Basilio claims for himself is kind of like, look how smart I am, but it really is, I pulled one off. I pulled one over on you. And I think that is different from the ingenuity that the author is talking about with Don Quixote.
So, Basilio's ingenuity seems similar to Anselmo's in The Tale of Inappropriate Curiosity, insofar as both devised a scheme to deceive their beloveds in order to find out what's really in their hearts, or something like that. Or maybe that's not what, I don't know if that's the right way to characterize Basilio's interest in deceiving Quiteria. Maybe he just wants to get the words to come out of her mouth. I do, and I'm of sound mind, so forth.
Right. He
but
wants
that's not
to marry
like,
her, but and Selma wants to prove he married the best woman. So it's something
Right.
they both want, and they're willing to use deception to get it.
but you're saying Quixote's ingenuity also involves something theatrical, maybe, but it's getting lost in a fantasy rather than deliberately perpetrating a falsehood.
He's not running around. He's not like, what's the guy with the puppets. He's not like running a fraud, okay?
Right.
The guy with the puppets probably is, even several levels beyond Basilio in running a fraud. I don't think we're meant to think Don Quixote is perpetrating a fraud on people.
Mm-hmm.
He's caught in a belief system that he believes in, although we know now that in his heart he's a little nervous about whether he's really, such a good knight errant. But he's not trying to deceive. But so to me, his ingeniousness has more to do with his imagination and his fantasy, his ability to almost buy into fantasy, as opposed to the ingenuity of these other people that seems to me more manipulative and deceptive.
So Anselmo and Basilio and Ginés de Pasamonte / Don Pedro, they construct false images of the world, or they give these false constructions of the world. Likewise, Don Quixote. It's just that Quixote believes his own, and he's not deliberately trying to mislead anyone else, whereas these other three knowingly mislead someone about how the world is. Okay, thank you.
And I'm not sure also if you just look at his intention is to do good. His intention is not to get something for himself, regardless of how he does it. Mm-hmm. At least that's the way I read him. And so intention, in addition, is different. His intention.
Wait, who's the he? Is that Quixote?
Don Quixote, yes.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. He wants to help other people. He wants to, I suppose in an ego sense he does, but he does really want to do good. He doesn't want, it isn't for what I would consider kind of only selfish purposes.
Yeah, fair enough. Charles, go ahead.
I would agree with Cindy. I would characterize it though with Basilio as it's more trickery than anything. I mean, he went to elaborate lengths to put the little tube to fake him dying, and then he kept carrying it on. He's more of a trickster, I think.
Yeah, there's something more theatrical. He's really good at. It's an amazing stunt. Quixote, he doesn't really fool anyone. They all think this guy's not really a knight errant. he's the only one who seems to be really convinced of the fiction, whereas the opposite is true with Basilio. He convinces everyone who witnesses what happens that he's killed himself, it seems. Okay, so we've got an answer to the question of why count both of these people as ingenious or as capable of ingenuity, and a means of distinguishing Quixote and Basilio from one another along these lines, and what the nature of their ingenuity is. Okay, so any other thoughts about how to connect the Basilio Camacho Quiteria episode to either themes to do with theater, so the morality play, the maybe the theatricality that we said is inherent in what Quixote does, the actors that we saw previously dueling as theatricality, or to connect this story to the other love stories that we've seen so far. So love triangle involving Quiteria, Camacho, and Basilio. Does that have any interesting points of contact with these other love stories, the stories of courtship and rivalry and so forth that we've seen throughout the novel? Those are two different questions, by the way, rather than one. Steve?
This is about a half-baked thought, but I'll let it out of my mouth anyhow. This is in almost all the other stories, and I think it's all the other stories, it's really clear who the good guy is and who the bad guy is, or good woman and bad woman. There's a lot of moral clarity there. This is the first time that that's not there, and whether it's right versus right or wrong versus wrong, or I mean, the need for an ingenious, solution doesn't come out when, I mean, solving, figure out what the right answer is when you have good and bad or good and evil is pretty straightforward. Getting there may be really difficult. What's different about this story is the notion that, the question of what's right and what's wrong, in this case, gets solved by a third principle, what works. And so I think that that's, to me, the biggest difference or the evolution in terms of ingenuity is around, again, in a moral, Don Quixote is trying to be the ultimate moral paragon in his return to chivalry. And in some cases, that moral framework doesn't yield a clear answer.
Okay, so is this the right way to frame this thought? Don Fernando is a clear villain before he's not. With the conflicts involving Dorotea, Cardenio, and Lucinda, it's obvious what should have happened. And nearly taking back everything that Don Fernando has done before what he does at the end, that's what would have been just, or redressing his evil deeds would have been just. Likewise with Zoraida and the captive, we're just rooting for them. It's not very clear that what they're doing is morally ambiguous, at least from the perspective of the author. Doña Clara and Don Luis, they should be together. In the Tale of Inappropriate Curiosity, it's like pretty clear that Anselmo is doing a bad thing, and likewise, eventually, that Lotario is doing a bad thing. And in the conflict with, likewise for Vicente, who deceives Leandra, in the conflict between, involving these three lovers, it's not clear that Camacho or Basilio, who's more deserving, or whether Quiteria should be with one of them rather than the other. So what we're focused on is not the question of how to overcome the bad guy, but how to produce an outcome of a certain kind. I take it there are still moral questions about this story. about the means by which this outcome is achieved, and likewise about the way the marriage between Camacho and Quiteria has been arranged in the first place. Is it good that Quiteria was going to marry Camacho just because he's a rich guy and her father wanted it that way? Is it good that she's going to end up marrying a poor guy just because he's happened to pull the right trick? What about the status of that trick? Was the marriage made under duress? So there are moral questions here, but there's not a clear bad guy. There's just ambiguities around the characters. Is that right, Steve?
It is, and again, just extrapolating for a little bit. Long ago, had a boss who told me, figuring out the right answer to, when you've got a good option and a bad option is really easy. Okay, it's when the discussion between good and better or bad and worse.
Mm-hmm.
And those are higher order questions and don't fall into neat answers. And I think it's a progression of the book and the situations. I mean, this is a notion of that, to some degree, these stories can feel a little endless because of the not just the sameness occasionally, but the nature of the problem. And I think what he's done here, and obviously intentionally, this is the book that he wrote, but whether he meant that to be a heightening of the type of problem that Don Quixote is being asked to solve, that's clearly what he's done.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just that we can see what's interesting about the story involving Basilio, Quiteria, and Camacho because it's set off by all these stories that have come before, where they all had bad guys and this one doesn't, and that makes it morally more complicated. But also that Quixote is asked to solve this problem, or he steps in to solve it in a way that he, so he's stepping into a situation where it's not obvious what the answer is as to who should prevail. He comes in theatrically, dramatically, cites a few principles that sound pretty good, but that Karen and you gave us reasons for doubting or should really persuade us. And this is Cervantes giving us a morally ambiguous, difficult problem to solve, and Quixote solving it kind of blithely by citing principles that we shouldn't really trust. And all of that seems like it's set up by the way this story is different from the others that are similar to, but notably different from it. Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting. So, I mean, I take it that, well, that does really point to the question that we were asking before. Does Quixote solve this well? Is the solution satisfying? What are the moral problems here if they're more complicated than the ones that we were coping with earlier? I think Larry has given us a stab at that. Well, there's a violation of the autonomy of Quiteria in the eliciting of her marriage vows. Cindy has also given us some thoughts like this is good for Camacho, so good in that it frees him from his a marriage that he would have entered into in a condition of material ignorance about the backstory. And likewise, this is merit of some kind, triumphing over class and considerations of wealth. Any other thoughts about how to connect, either how to think about this story and its moral problems, or problems about settling what's good and right and so forth, about Quixote's role in it, about the way that relates to the other love stories we've seen, about the use of theater here on Basilio's part? Okay, then I will move us on. So, should I read this or should I have us read this paragraph and question 4? We get this note at the beginning of 24 from Cide Hamete Benengeli, who says, well, I can't believe everything that happened, that Quixote says about what happened in the Cave of Montesinos is true. On the other hand, I don't think he was lying because he was such an honest hidalgo and a noble knight. And anyway, when he was dying, he said to have retracted it all and stated that he made it all up because he thought it tallied well with the adventures that he'd read about in his histories. Okay, what do you think? This is pretty jarring. There's a lot here. How should we interpret this note? Is there any sense in him calling Quixote an honest hidalgo? I mean, I take it the sense in which Quixote is ingenious that Cindy was drawing out is that he's genuinely believes his own fantasies, at least for the most part, his false construction of the world rather than deliberately deceiving other people. So that's compatible with honesty. You could be honest about how you think the world is and be wildly wrong, and even motivated by your desire that the world be a certain way in your report, that it is that way, right? We could also just think, no, he's not honest. That's a ridiculous thing to say about Quixote. He's a, if not a liar, he doesn't have the kind of mental equilibrium to be capable of honesty or something like that. Larry, go ahead.
This had the effect of pulling this reader in apart in terms of trying to understand what's being said here. We have Benengeli, who, if we're to believe, I presume he's a liar because he's a Moor or an Arab, giving a true history of events that center around a dream. Montesino's cave. And so I find myself in trying to understand what's going on here, to be pulled in opposite directions in terms of even beginning to understand the nature of this narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Is Don Quixote, is he delusional? Is he having an out-of-body experience? Is he schizophrenic? Is he all of the above? I don't know. I don't know what to make of this because of the ambiguity of of the story.
Right. Okay. So I take it a few questions there. I mean, it seems like Cide Hamete Benengeli is being scrupulous about admitting that he can't stand behind this and discussing the considerations as to why you might think Quixote was telling what he thought to be the truth or not, and declaring his neutrality as to its truth or falsity. He says, I merely record it without affirming either that it is false or that it is true. And if this guy as Quixote and our narrator is a liar by virtue of being a Moor, well then, man, that bumps up strangely against his scrupulousness and his declaration of neutrality here.
Exactly.
And then there's also the question about Quixote's mindset. If he's telling a falsehood, which we presume, how do we explain that? Is he mad? Was he dreaming? Is he being a deliberate deceiver here for some reason? Yeah, I think that's all on the table. Cindy, go ahead.
So I thought it was pretty clear he was dreaming, okay? Because he explains on 638 that as they let out the rope, he sees this little concave space. And so he goes in there and then he lets the rope wind. And that is consistent with the way they pull him up. Remember, when they pull him up, it's so light that they think they've lost him, right? Which would make sense. If he's got this rope all piled up, that went first, and then they got to him. So what physically they said happened is consistent. And then he says he went in and he was very tired and he was overcome by a deep sleep. And then I awoke and found, and then he goes through the whole thing, which he thinks is real because it fits in with you know, I mean, and people dream about the things they read about and believe, right? That's not an unusual thing to happen. And then, and so he tells the whole story, and then he claims it's like it took him 3 days, and they said you were down there, I forget, half an hour or however long he was. So, I mean, I don't know the story about. It is said at the end that he retracted it and stated he made it up because he thought it tallied well with adventures he had read. You know, maybe that's what happened years and years later. But certainly at this time, that's what I understood. And the other thing that I thought about this is how many of the epic histories or myths we know, the Odyssey, Aeneid, at some point somebody goes down to hell, right? Don't they? Everybody travels to hell. And this to me was like, I thought it was clever. It was like the way Don Quixote went, in a sense, similar to these other travelers, into this realm that was, if the rest of it was hard to believe, this is like the guy pulls the guy's heart out and takes it to the wife and then he's still alive. All that stuff is probably the equivalent of the trips to the underworld of in these other things. So I thought that was kind of the, what he was doing. But in terms of believing the story, I thought he set it up so much as I was asleep in this little concave things, and then I woke up and this happened. I think it pretty much was a dream, and it just followed through what he wanted to, and perhaps he embellished that dream because, he of course knew the backstory of it, but I thought that was consistent, and it was consistent with the way they pulled him up on the rope.
Larry, you want to respond to that? Larry, you're muted.
Cindy, I wanted to respond to you. Layer that dream upon all the other fantasies and imaginings that are going on in this character's mind.
And what do you get by doing that? Like you get the thought, how do you distinguish dream from waking reality for Quixote? It's all the same. He's always dreaming.
It's like he has a puppet show going on in his mind all day long. I mean, in terms of fantasizing about what's happening in the world around him.
Well, that's a nice transition. My next question is about a puppet show. Maybe we should move on and think about it in relation to this. So there's this run-in, the second run-in third, that Quixote and Sancho have with Ginés de Pasamonte, this time in disguise as Master Pedro. So I've given 4 aspects of this run-in that seem to me like they could yield some interesting thoughts if we subject them to interpretation. I take it the 5B is directly pertinent to what Larry just said. Master Pedro, Ginés de Pasamonte in disguise, makes his living in part by giving puppet show and also running this con with the wise ape, the truth-telling ape. Quixote gets sucked into the puppet show. It's a very Quixote thing to do. He attacks the puppets after having criticized the accuracy, the puppet show on the grounds that it's inaccurate. Moors don't use bells to sound alarms, they beat kettle drums. So what do you think? Is this just Quixote's normal madness exhibited in a clever new way that he gets sucked into the theater? Does it have anything to do with the elements of theater that we've seen in previous chapters that seems to be a major theme of part 2 of Quixote, Don Quixote? Larry? Larry, you're muted again.
Sorry, how about the commentary on the boy who's narrating the puppet show? He's being too wordy, he's being too descriptive. It's sort of a riff on storytelling, I thought.
Yeah, it's
And,
It's
and,
like-
and, and what's so interesting about it is that this entire novel is based on digressions and, over description, lots of digressions and so on and so forth. So when I was reading this, I burst out laughing about the criticism this kid is getting in terms of his, his narrative ability at this puppet show.
so the thought is like Cervantes has Master Pedro, quote unquote, and the audience criticizing this boy for telling the story in the way that he does, in the way that someone might criticize Cervantes' novel. They have the same faults as works of narrative.
Yes.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought.
Yes.
And it invites the comparison between scenes in which there's theater of one kind or another and what Cervantes is doing with this novel. There's something, there's a kind of self-examination that he seems to be engaged in when he's portraying scenes of theater or trickery or sucking someone into a story. That's what he's doing to us. It seems like he's thinking about that somehow through the story. Steve, go ahead.
I drew a little bit of a different connection. I mean, the only thing that he totally tears into, okay, he does some, light touches and parroting. He totally tears into people who write bad books, who tell false stories, okay? And so this is Don Quixote being the personification of Cervantes, okay? Here's the false story. I point out a few things, and I get crapped into it, and I chop off all their heads. I mean, this is the metaphorical equivalent of talking about bad writing and why bad writing and bad storytelling is so terrible.
So this is what Cervantes would like to do to the books that yeah.
Absolutely.
The ultimate form of criticism. Yeah, you just chop up all the puppets. Okay. So maybe Quixote's criticisms are legitimate, or if not, they're of a legitimate form, and the sentiment is very relatable for Cervantes. Namely, when you see bad theater or bad literature, man, don't you want to do what Quixote does? Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because that conflates Quixote's, one way to think about this question that I've asked in 5B, this is the way that I thought about it intuitively, is it's very strange to criticize the veracity of a work of fiction and then get so sucked into the fiction, the fantasy of the fiction, that you can't distinguish it from nonfiction, from real life, from what's outside of the fiction. But it sounds, Steve, like you're saying, actually, at the moment when Quixote starts chopping the puppets to pieces, he's serving as both a critic, someone who's able to stand outside the fiction and point out its flaws, and in some ways, like as somebody who's so captivated by the fiction and thereby attests to its success to draw him in, that he attacks it. So like the same gesture, he's critic and in rapt audience member attacking the characters in the fiction. That's complicated. Usually the one precludes the other, but here they're maybe collapsed into one image. Any other thoughts about either this scene where Quixote criticizes and then attacks the puppet show, about this figure of Pasamonte, this great criminal who is writing what he said was the greatest picaresque ever written, who's now making his living as a con man and a guy who makes puppet shows about what seems like chivalric episodes or stories. About Quixote blaming enchanters for his mistake, about the fact that, well, there's a reveal of Pasamonte's identity. Cindy?
Well, I had a comment about your issue about the repeated theme about theater. in plays. I think we earlier had a whole section about people who had to write plays kind of that weren't as good as they could have been because they were more popular. Remember that whole discussion about having to write popular plays, and that maybe we should have somebody, a censor or something. I don't know. We had a whole discussion about censorship in plays. And that kind of comes back at 666, where Don Quixote is starting to object about the accuracy of this play and the blunders. And he said, Pedro says, don't worry about trivialities. Aren't thousands of plays performed all the time full of thousands of blunders and absurdities? And despite that, they have a good run and are greeted not only with applause, but with admiration too. You carry on, my lad, and let them say what they like. So long as I fill my money bags, it doesn't matter if I make more blunders than there are atoms in the sun.
Mhm.
So it's very much of a repetition of this theme. Now, maybe, I don't know, did Cervantes have issues with the popularity or unpopularity, or his plays were great but they didn't make enough money? I have no idea, but it appears that is an issue. You know, people still say, why are we doing, why is Broadway all Disney remakes as opposed to real theater? Well, they make money, so maybe at that time they were having those same issues. But when you're asking about how theater themes keep coming back, that theme keeps coming back, is that the plays that are most popular are not necessarily the most quality plays, but they make money.
Right. So the source of these thoughts, it's chapter 48 of part 1. It's the priest saying,
right,
look, there are all these terrible plays that are written in, it's 442 to 446. If you want to have a look, it's a long speech. The priest says, there are all these bad plays. The impresarios and the actors there and the writers, they blame it on the audiences. They say, this is what people want. They want bad theater, so it's not our fault. But the priest says, there's lots of good theater that has a good run. It's quite popular, so that's no excuse. And maybe we just need a censor to weed out the good from the bad and make sure that only good stuff that's both entertaining and edifying makes it to the stage and well constructed. I mean, I don't know whether Cervantes has a position on this, but it seems clear, Cindy, given that this is repeated. I mean, first of all, he's like, the arguments he puts in the mouth of the priest are really interesting, so he seems interested in there. And likewise, they reappear in the mouth of Gines disguised as Master Pedro here. So he's interested in the tension between the popularity of a literary genre, plays, books of chivalry, and the criticism that they're poorly made, morally corrupting, so fine that they shouldn't be handled by the masses, the kind of fragility of the people receiving them, or the fragility of the literature itself. I don't know whether he's got a position, but he's really interested in this theme. What do you think? It sounded like you were, or looked like you were going to respond.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and truthfulness and accuracy. That's part of, and that runs in not just plays, but everything else. And basically, when Don Quixote's saying that that's a blunder, then, Master Pedro comes back and says, all these popular things are full of blunders. So I don't know if it's more acceptable at the theater level than in the history level. I mean, we've dealt with that throughout. Is it better to be truthful? But certainly it appears that the theater is just full of things people are enjoying that are without truth, that aren't very accurate. So
I mean, we've heard characters say the same thing about books of chivalry. They're really attached to books of chivalry, even though other characters say, oh, those things are full of absurdities and they contain lots of falsehoods and they mislead people. And some characters profess love for false histories, what they take to be histories, but they. And so this seems like it's not confined to plays, but it does turn up with respect to plays.
And my guess, though I've never met him, is that Cervantes is given this, leans towards entertainment and really being you know, he doesn't seem like a guy that's that, I mean, what is the truth here? You know, we've been spending all of our classes trying to figure that out, but it is certainly great entertainment. And so, and I think he knows that. I'm not saying he doesn't care about the truth, but the product he's given us is generally pretty good on the entertainment part of it. It's a little more questionable on the truthful part of it.
Well, he's getting us at least to reflect on what truth is. So in that respect, he's making us philosophically more alive to conceptions of truth. Okay, so it does not seem an accident along these same lines that Ginés de Pasamontes' first literary work, so he claims, and other people attest to it, is entirely truthful. So it seems it's an autobiography. And he says it's going to be the best picaresque ever written. And here we've got something that, is it he on 666 who defends it by saying, I don't care if it contains absurdities, it makes me money, so that's all that matters. I haven't found the line.
Yeah,
it is at the top of 666.
It says, when Master Pedro heard this, he stopped ringing his bells and said, so it's Master Pedro.
So it seems like there's something going on with that. Earlier, he's bragging about his work of his picaresque novel, this autobiography, and it seems fairly clear that it's meant to be true. It's the story of his life. He won't finish it before he can write the rest on the basis of what he does with the rest of his life. Whereas here he's saying, I don't care if it contains blunders or absurdities so long as it makes me money. Why have the same character be doing both of these things? It seems like Cervantes is doing something with this. He's interested in the very question I think that you're pointing to, Cindy, namely whether this character should care for the truth or absurdities or blunders or so forth, rather than just being popular. I mean, he's written a work where he didn't have to choose. It was both extremely entertaining, the finest picaresque ever written, and the true story of his life. What's going on with that? Is he Cervantes just recycling a character because he knows it'd be fun to dress him up in a different costume and have another adventure with him or something? Or is there something actually meaningful to having Don Pedro be Ginés de Pasamonte? Sorry? You're muted again, Larry, sorry.
I'll get it right one of these days. But, Don Pedro is trying to keep himself one step ahead of the law. He's in disguise. Doesn't he he wears a patch over one eye, and maybe there's some other things going on. So the notion that he's writing an autobiography about all of his grifting is sort of humorous. He's not right. I don't think, is he writing it under his own real name?
It seems like it.
Is it why would he do that?
I mean, he hasn't published it, so maybe he can maintain his
He's trying to stay one step ahead of the law.
Yeah, it's a weird thing for a criminal to do, especially if he's undercover, as he has been ever since, so it seems, Quixote freed him from the chain gang, or the prisoners being conveyed to the galleys.
Right. So it's just like a contradiction.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no confirmation later on that he's still writing this, but he was so committed to it, this autobiography, but he was so committed to it earlier, so proud of it, that you expect it's kind of in the works still.
Right.
I don't know, maybe he can keep it a secret and just publish it on his deathbed or something, and maintain his disguise. But he's certainly a character in whom it seems like Cervantes is playing with the idea of conning, telling the truth, telling lies, telling an entertaining, but
and identity, the vagaries of identity of what is real, who is a real, who is this person, who is any person, But particularly this character of Don Pedro.
Mhm. So it seems striking that this guy, Quixote in some sense, is like willing a novel about himself into existence, but it's a different genre, and it's if Quixote had his way, it would be highly fantastical. Even though if we're reading it, then it's not. We're alive to the idea that it's not. It's just a fantasy.
It's pretty fantastical.
Well, if he were writing it, it would be a fantasy. But since he's not, it's a story about a character trapped in a fantasy. Does it have fantastical elements also? Are there things in here that just couldn't possibly have happened? I don't know. I mean, I guess having there are things that are silly.
The windmill. What about the encounter? What about the enchanted boat?
Sorry, from sideways on, we're not. If Quixote were right about what's going on with him, yeah, it would be totally fantastical. But we're being told by the narrator that Quixote is trapped in a fantasy, and that story doesn't seem like it's a fantasy in the same way that the story that Quixote takes himself to be in is a fantasy. All I was doing with this contrast was to say, riffing on what you were saying about Master Pedro and Ginés de Pasamonte, Larry, is Quixote and Ginés de Pasamonte, in a way, are both willing books about themselves into existence. But the one that Quixote takes himself to be writing is entirely fantastical, we think, whereas the one that Pasamonte is writing, we think is the truth about his life.
The true history.
Right. Cindy, your hand was up and went down. Did you want to weigh in? No. Okay.
Yeah, I just went back to like, why does this character? I just went back to the release of the prisoners, and he really was the most interesting prisoner. Remember, he was shackled differently, and they were saying he has done more crimes and such a villain. And they actually talk about the book that early. It says on 182. Let me tell you, I'm not going to be able to say his name, Ginés de Pasamonte, and my life has been written by these very fingers here. Now he's telling the truth. He's written his own life history himself, and a good one it is too, and he pawned the book in prison for 200 reals. And I mean to redeem it, and I would even if I pawned it for 200 ducats. It's as good as all that. It is so good. And then he's going on. What I tell you is that it deals with facts, and that they're such fine and funny facts, no lies could ever match them. And what is the title of your book? The Life of Ginés de Pasamonte. And Don Quixote says, have you finished it? How can I finish it yet if my life hasn't finished yet? So I didn't remember that, but that was all at the very, very beginning, right? It's like at 182.
Yeah.
So he has written it, and it is truthful.
So Cervantes is reprising that same character here, but he has to be a con man in disguise.
Right.
Who's telling a puppet story that's so persuasive to Quixote that Quixote has to chop the puppets to pieces because he worries that Melisendra is going to be caught by the Moors again, and Don Gaiferos and so forth. Why? Why that same guy? I take it as, yeah, that's the question that I would like an answer to. I mean, obviously Cervantes is playing with the same themes, but like, what is he doing with them? Any other thoughts about this episode with Master Pedro / Ginés de Pasamonte? Anything interesting here? Well, let me skip question 6 for the meantime, and I'll come back to it if we have time, because there's another question about theater, which it seems like it's useful to ask right on the heels of this other question about theater and our discussions of theater. Quixote has what might otherwise seem like a kind of throwaway line with a casually chosen image, but given that theater has shown up so many times in our reading for today and is on the lips of several different characters in the passages we've been talking about, it doesn't seem casual. It seems like this is meaningful. After having his adventure with the boat not come out the way that he wanted to, Quixote says, well, there must be competing enchanters, one who gave us the boat and one who stopped me from getting to the island prison, which presumably was the purpose that he took for the, he thought the boat was for. It was going to help him rescue whoever was in the prison. And Quixote says, may God send a remedy, for everything in this world is trickery, stage machinery, every part of it working against every other part. I've done all I can. Okay, so he says, it's all theater. Everything I'm coping with, it's theater. You know, whether that's theater managed by enchanters or otherwise, it's theater. What do you think? How should we think about this remark in relation to the theatrical performances we've seen in chapters 20, 21, 27? The morality play, the Basilios trick, the puppet show, the discussions of theater elsewhere. What's going on with this? Steve, go ahead.
I'm just wondering whether, is theater a very, very close cousin to enchantment? You know, the whole notion that he falls back in terms of if something happens that isn't supposed to be, it's because they were enchanted. It's a question of who is the performance for?
Mm-hmm.
And in the case where he says it didn't come out where what, therefore, it was it's a castle, not an inn. And we're living in a fictional world, and so I there's something, and I'm not expressing it quite clearly. It's not quite clear in my head, but the notion. I mean, you talk about theater as enchantment. A great theatrical performance is enchanting. You believe that what you're seeing on the stage is true. You feel for the characters. You're crying at the end, even though you know that these are paid actors on a stage and everyone's going to take off their makeup and go home at the end. And so the nature of what he's poking at here, I think, is that kind of impermeability. I mean, because usually he would ordinarily blame it on enchantment. Here he's blaming it on theater. I think he's blaming it on I think he's identifying the same problem and describing it differently.
That's interesting. I mean, it seems like, I was going to say, yeah, there is a similarity between theater and enchantment. And I thought there was actually a different aspect of enchantment that he was trying to pick out that's similar to theater, but maybe it's what you're saying also. So he does say everything in this world is trickery, which is to say it's appears one way, but it's really another way, and the appearance is really convincing. So I'm deceived the way that theater sucks you in and deceives you. So,
but and you call the enchantment true. I mean, and at a certain point, your ability to tell the difference between truth, whatever that might be, and the enchanted version is simply in the eyes of the beholder. Do you believe what you're seeing? Do you not believe what you're seeing?
Mm-hmm. I mean, my thought when I originally thought, that this was not tracking what Quixote was saying, was that the feature of theater that he's picking out is that the outcome is pre-cooked, or like he thinks he can intervene, but really the enchanters are in control, not the characters, or the writer is writing it, or I don't know what to compare him, who to compare him to, either a character in the story or an audience member. But in any case, someone else is orchestrating the events and making sure that they come out one way. What do you think?
Well, it kind of goes back to the previous story. We talked about, he recognizes it as being wrong, okay, that points out all the problems, but he gets sucked in despite himself. He has essentially been enchanted. His logical, to Karin's metaphor, the rider on top of the elephant sees it, and at the end of the day, the elephant and the perception just takes over, and he succumbs to the emotions. He succumbs to the enchantment.
I see. Yeah, that's interesting. So Quixote, maybe in the puppeteer. So now I want to know how to connect this observation about the scene with the puppetry with this remark after his misfortune with the boat. In the scene with puppetry, Quixote, in criticizing the veracity of the puppet show, he evinces a rational ability to distinguish the show from the literal truth of what's
Right.
happening in front of his eyes. He recognizes
And
the show
as
as such.
the show progresses, he loses that ability.
And your thought is that's a different part of him that is taking over, namely the elephant that he's riding. His emotional self is overriding his the rational part that distinguishes appearance from reality and can criticize the
And
appearance.
another way to describe that would be being enchanted.
So the enchantment, the resort to enchantment explains why his emotional part took over. When your emotional part wins out, it's as if you're enchanted by the appearance. You can't distinguish appearance from reality. False appearances get you. Is that also what's going on with the boat then? Or is it just something?
I think it's related. It's not exactly the same, but I think that he's recognizing the theater, the theatrical underpinnings of the enchantment for what they are.
That's interesting. So that's actually the reverse of what goes on, at least in chronology, with the puppet show. So the puppet show, it's first he's got critical distance, and then he gets sucked in, and maybe he blames enchanters when he gets to step back again and realize his folly. So maybe it is the same. But here, he thinks he's on an adventure. A sage must have provided the boat. Then he thinks a sage or an enchanter is thwarting his ability to use the boat for its proper adventure, namely to rescue the prisoners inside the island fort. And afterward, he can say, "Oh, this is all theater." He's not taken in by the kind of fortuitousness of the boat anymore. The fact, the possibility that this just happened spontaneously. He can have a critical distance on what was going on with the episode and say, that was the outcome wasn't determined by me. It was all false appearances that I was being sucked in by. Is that right?
I just sort of don't want to. I mean, the describing it all as theater is a little bit of the broken clock is right twice a day. Yeah, it is. But again, as we're used to Quixote saying it was enchanted, that as being his usual excuse for why something didn't turn out the way it should have. Here he ends with everything in the world is trickery, stage machinery, every part of it working against every other part. That sounds like what an evil enchanter would do to a story to make him do something or to prevent him from being able to meet his goal.
Okay. Any other thoughts about this remark about the scene with the boats? Quixote is saying this is all trickery, stage machinery. All right, let me ask about the story of the Brain Counselors. Very, very, very silly episode. One of the sillier ones in a very silly book. Any thoughts about this? How should we interpret this story? What is it doing here? Is it just here to amuse us and nothing else? Is any aspect of it especially interesting? I mean, Quixote tries to intervene with this expertise on when it's right to take offense and under what conditions between individuals. It makes sense to quarrel over an insult, but not between groups of people for whatever reason. What is going on in this episode? Any thoughts about it? Alec?
It's just interesting to, again, observe the contradictions on Don Quixote's ideas and analysis to his actions. For example, page 677, when he was analyzing this, he says, like, he who withdraws does not flee if his courage is not based on prudence is called foolhardiness. And whereas when he faces perceived danger, he risks his life and sometimes other people's lives to pursue imaginary situations. It's definitely not based on prudence or logic. But when he does that, he considers them noble. So that's just more contradictions between what he thinks and what he practices.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is the elephant leading the rider again. He's great at coming up with principles to pretty up his actions, make them embellish them, make them look like they're more. His actions were more principled than they seem to be in the moment. It's kind of be right.
By the way, that analogy, riding the elephant, is that from the happiness hypothesis, or is that an analogy that existed from other places already?
It's a change management analogy
I see.
popularized by Dan and Chip Heath. If you want to look into it.
And Haidt uses it in the happiness hypothesis.
I see. Thanks.
Plato and Nietzsche have very similar images, not elephants really, but similar things. Boat on a great river, steamboat on a great river is Nietzsche's, and Plato's got, human being attached to a great beast, for instance, in the Republic. But anyway, this is I think it's what happens inside the soul is apt material for image making of this kind. Should we talk about the Duke and Duchess to finish things off? So the Duke and Duchess are theater makers again. They are putting on a show for Quixote. We're going to see them doing this throughout, I think, all of our reading for next time, if not beyond, in order to reflect back to him, basically, how he takes himself to be, the welcome that they give him, that makes him feel for the first time that he's a real knight errant and not a fantasy one. I take it is a work of an accomplishment of theater. They get all their servants to line up and engage in this grand ceremony to recognize Quixote. The first person, maybe one of the only people to call them out on this, is the churchman, who's kind of a disagreeable figure. He's a bit of a martinet. Let me ask these two things, 8 and 9, alongside one another. So any other thoughts about Quixote's reflection on that moment in which he's being welcomed by the Duke and Duchess's servants? That it's the first day that when he feels fully convinced that he was a real knight errant, not a fantasy one. We've talked a bit about how we should think about this. It's very jarring, given that it's coming 700 pages into a novel in which he seems to have been convinced all along that he's a real knight errant and not a fantasy one, but okay. But any new thoughts about this in light of this connection to theater? This is being evoked, this thought in him, by what seems to be a staged performance by the servants who welcome Quixote, that the Duke and the Duchess, these sort of super fans of the book, have arranged for him. And likewise, the churchman seems to take issue with the Duke for something, if not exactly nurturing Quixote's delusions, it's something very close. He says it's very brief, but in some ways, the Duke and the Duchess are such morally questionable characters, what they do, that seeing anyone give them what for, I'm tempted to read something into it. He says, "Sir, your grace," this is at 699 to 700. "Sir, your grace will have to answer to our Lord for this fellow's doings. I imagine that this Don Quixote, or Don Idiot, or whatever his name is not so much of a fool as your grace would like to turn him into by encouraging him to perform his preposterous and ludicrous antics." So, any thoughts either about the Duke and the Duchess eliciting Quixote's belief in himself through theater, or the churchman's objection to their doing so, at least the Duke's doing so. Are you sympathetic to the churchmen at all? I mean, for instance, Karen, go ahead.
I had this thought I can't get out of my head. It's not exactly targeted at your question, but this whole idea of theatrical quality that we've been talking about and where they are right now at the end, it's like, it's as though Cervantes and William Shakespeare collaborated on As You Like It. Like the whole idea, like all the world's a stage and all the men and women are players on it. It's almost like Don Quixote has been, without admitting it, playing a part like for these whole 700 pages. And now for the first time, he actually believes the part he's playing. You know, when the Duke and Duchess, you know, provide the whole big fan response. But anyway, it just is interesting to me. I mean, that it gets back to the fake it till you make it kind of idea that you were talking about, Noah, but it just seems like all of a sudden that this whole long journey has been him playing a part so actively that now he's now, you know, he, for the first time, he's starting to believe he really is.
Mhm. Yeah, okay. I think we're gonna have lots more to talk about with respect to that very thing in the following chapters in which the Duke and the Duchess drive Quixote even more deeply into his fantasy. So thank you, Karen. It's an apt final thought. All right, well, it is 9:16 my time, so I think we should call it a night, and I will see you all next week to talk about the next tranche of chapters. Thanks for the discussion, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
I'm very
Good night.
excited for next Monday, San